Imagine you're standing in a muddy field just after dawn. The air is thick with fog and tension. All around you are men, some shivering, some praying, some sharpening blades already darkened by age and rust. There's no glorious music, no heroic speeches, just the sound of boots sinking into wet earth and the occasional nervous cough. This is not a tournament. This is not a scene from a knightly tale. This is a medieval battle, and it's about to begin. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. The myth of the medieval battle is one of gleaming armor, trumpet calls, and brave charges across grassy fields. But if you peel back the legend, what actually happened was far messier, more chaotic, and infinitely more human. To understand it, we have to start before the fighting even begins, with how an army formed. Medieval warfare was not about professional standing armies. That concept wouldn't emerge in Europe until much later. In the early and high Middle Ages, armies were ad hoc gatherings, drawn from the feudal web of obligations. A king or lord would summon his vassals, who were then required to show up with a certain number of men, knights, infantry, sometimes archers, depending on their wealth and status. These hastily assembled forces often lacked standard training or coordination. A knight from Normandy might be fighting alongside a levy from Flanders, with completely different equipment, dialects, and understanding of tactics. And don't imagine pristine uniforms. The average soldier's gear was a patchwork of whatever could be afforded, borrowed, or stolen. Marching to the battlefield was an ordeal in itself. Long, winding roads, days or weeks of travel, poor food, no sanitation, and constant risk of disease meant many never even reached the field. Those who did were already weary. And yet, this was when things got serious. The battlefield wasn't always a wide-open plain. Often, it was chosen for strategic reasons: control of a river crossing, the defense of a town, the trap of a narrow pass. Other times, armies simply collided by chance and had to fight where they stood. No neat rows or perfect lines, just rough terrain, uneven ground, and the need to survive. Let's talk about what you'd see and hear as the two armies prepared. Imagine the day before battle. Scouts return with news. The enemy is approaching. The camp becomes tense. There is a rush to find favorable ground. Soldiers dig shallow ditches, sharpen stakes, fortify weak spots. Men check and recheck their weapons. Nobles consult priests for blessings. There might be one last meal, usually salted meat or stale bread. There is little sleep. The night is filled with the sounds of armor clinking, horses snorting, and whispered prayers. At first light, trumpets or horns might sound, not to inspire, but to signal orders. Leaders try to impose some sort of structure. Knights form in blocks. Infantry, often peasants or lower-class freemen, cluster together with spears, axes, or even farming tools. Archers take position if the terrain allows. There is shouting, movement, last-minute repositioning. Dust clouds rise. Horses stamp in impatience. And then silence. For a few eternal seconds, the world holds its breath. The first real action usually came from the archers or crossbowmen, not with precision, but with volume. Arrows filled the sky like deadly rain. They didn't aim at individuals, they aimed at groups. The hope was not always to kill, but to disrupt, to wound, to shake morale. If one side had cavalry, they might launch a charge. But cavalry didn't just race across the field like in movies. Horses were expensive, and charging too early could be fatal. Commanders tried to wait until the enemy was disorganized or had overcommitted elsewhere. Then came the clash. It's hard to describe the sound of a medieval battle. Not the metallic ringing you hear in movies, but more like a constant roar, metal on bone, screams, war cries, panic, chaos. The smell was unforgettable: sweat, blood, excrement, mud, and fear. Men screamed in agony or rage. Some fought wildly, others stood frozen. Discipline often collapsed in the first few minutes. Infantry battles turned into pushing matches, literal shoving contests where lines met and men pressed forward with shields and bodies, trying to break through. It was exhausting. Most blows didn't kill, they maimed. A sword might cut a shoulder open, but it wouldn't always be fatal. A mace shattered bones beneath armor. An axe could hook a man's shield and yank it away. And most men didn't die instantly. They lay on the ground, bleeding out, crushed underfoot by comrades and enemies alike. Knights, despite their training, were not invincible. Their armor protected against cuts, but not against blunt trauma or suffocation in the mud. Many drowned in their own helmets or died when their horse was brought down and they couldn't get up. Command and control? Almost non-existent once the fighting started. Flags and horns could signal orders, but in the chaos, few could hear or see. Commanders often had to wade into battle themselves, relying on pre-battle instructions and the experience of their men. But make no mistake, there was no chivalry on the battlefield. Men fought dirty. Helmets were ripped off, throats were cut, groins were targeted. There were no timeouts, no mercy for the wounded. If you fell, you prayed your side won and found you before the enemy did. And then, as suddenly as it began, the tide turned. Battles didn't always last long. Some were decided in minutes, others dragged on for hours. Once one side began to rout, to flee, the killing intensified. This was when the most deaths occurred. A running man with no shield, no formation, and fear clouding his judgment was easy prey. Cavalry loved this moment, riders cutting down retreating footmen, turning victory into massacre. After the battle, the field was a nightmare. The wounded moaned, many for hours or days before dying. Looters picked over corpses, sometimes stripping the barely living. Nobles were sometimes captured for ransom, but commoners? They were often finished off. There was no battlefield medicine. A severed limb, a deep wound. It meant infection, slow death, or amputation without anesthetic. If you were lucky, a priest might give last rites. And the victors? They celebrated, but not always joyfully. Victory didn't erase the trauma. Men drank, shouted, tried to forget. Some broke down. PTSD wasn't named yet, but it lived in the eyes of every survivor. And yet, despite all of this, battles were relatively rare. Most medieval wars were skirmishes, sieges, or political maneuvering. Commanders were cautious. A battle was a gamble, and losing could mean losing everything. So why fight? For honor, for land, for glory, for God, for revenge, or because you were told to and had no choice. Motivation varied. Some believed deeply in their cause. Others just wanted loot. And some were there simply because their lord ordered them to come. What's clear is this. No matter how romantic the stories, real medieval battles were brutal, terrifying, and deeply human. To truly understand the reality of medieval battles, we have to look beyond generalities and into the real, documented chaos of specific moments in history. Not myths, not ballads. Actual encounters where blood was spilled, lives changed, and power shifted, often irreversibly. Let's begin with one of the most famous battles in English history, the Battle of Hastings, 1066. If you walked onto that battlefield in October of that year, you would have seen tension thick in the air. William, Duke of Normandy, had crossed the English Channel with a claim to the throne of England. On the other side stood King Harold Godwin's son, fresh from another battle in the north. His men were tired, but there was no time to rest. The fate of the English crown hung in the balance. Harold took a strong defensive position on Senlac Hill. His forces, primarily housecarls, the elite infantry of Anglo-Saxon England, and the FYRD, the militia drawn from the free population, formed a shield wall, a tactic as brutal as it was effective. Shoulder to shoulder, shields interlocked, axes and spears ready. They created a human wall that could absorb cavalry and infantry assaults alike. William's army was more mixed, Norman knights with their iconic kite shields and mail armor, archers, and infantry. He had the advantage of cavalry, but the hill was steep, and a direct charge uphill against a determined force was a recipe for disaster. The battle began with arrows, launched by William's archers, but they had little effect against the angled Saxon shields. The Normans then advanced uphill, infantry first, followed by cavalry. But the English held firm. The first wave broke on the wall like water on stone. Then came one of the most chaotic moments in the battle. A rumor spread among the Normans that William had been killed. Panic threatened to collapse the Norman advance. But William, either by bravery or instinct, lifted his helmet to show his face and rallied his men. This single action turned the tide from rout to resurgence. What followed was a long, grinding day of trial and error. The Normans realized that a full frontal assault wouldn't break the shield wall, so they changed tactics. Several times, the Normans feigned retreat, drawing segments of the English down the hill. Once the line was broken, the cavalry would turn and strike. These traps weakened Harold's position little by little. As dusk fell, Harold was struck down, either by a Norman knight or, as legend says, by an arrow to the eye. The shield wall finally crumbled. The battle was over. William had won, and England would never be the same. But Hastings is just one example of how terrain, tactics, and morale shaped the outcome of battle. Let's move forward almost 350 years to 1415 and the muddy fields of Agincourt. King Henry V, outnumbered and deep in French territory, faced a daunting enemy. The French army had superior numbers and heavy cavalry. The English, exhausted, disease-ridden, many of them archers. But what Henry had was something far more important than numbers: position and discipline. The battlefield was narrow, flanked by woods. The French had to advance in columns, which nullified their advantage in numbers. And the fields were thick with mud, thanks to autumn rains. Henry's men planted sharpened stakes in the ground, anti-cavalry defenses, and took up positions behind them. The English longbow, already famous, would prove devastating. The French, confident in their armor and nobility, charged. But their horses sank in the mud, their armor weighed them down, and English arrows rained from the sky. Knights fell, trampled by their own men. When they finally reached the English lines, they were exhausted and disorganized. And then came the horror. Imagine a knight, barely able to breathe inside his steel shell, slogging through knee-deep mud, finally reaching the enemy, only to be surrounded by men with hammers and knives. English archers, having run out of arrows, drew mallets and daggers and began butchering the downed nobility. Agincourt was a slaughter, not a chivalric contest. The French casualties were enormous. Henry lost perhaps a few hundred. The French lost thousands, many of them nobles. So much for honor. Let's look now at another type of medieval engagement: the siege. Sieges were far more common than open battles. Why? Because castles, fortresses, and walled cities were designed to be extremely difficult to attack directly. They offered protection for the defenders, and launching a frontal assault often led to disastrous losses. Take the siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099. The Crusaders had traveled thousands of miles, fighting through Anatolia and Syria. By the time they reached Jerusalem, they were starving, disease-ridden, and desperate. But they were determined to take the holy city. Jerusalem's defenders, primarily Muslim soldiers and residents, were well prepared. The city walls were formidable. The Crusaders lacked siege equipment, so they began building towers and battering rams from the limited wood they could find. They also tried to cut off supplies to the city, hoping to starve the defenders out. Eventually, after weeks of skirmishes and failed attacks, the Crusaders launched a final assault. Siege towers rolled toward the walls. One broke through. The Crusaders flooded into the city, and then came one of the most brutal massacres in medieval history. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood. Muslim, Jewish, even some Christian residents were slaughtered indiscriminately. Temples were looted. Fires raged. For the Crusaders, this was divine victory. For everyone else, it was apocalypse. That was medieval warfare. And sieges weren't always successful. Consider the siege of Kenilworth Castle in England, 1266. It lasted for 6 months, one of the longest in English history. The royal army tried everything: catapults, starvation, negotiation, but the defenders held out. Diseases broke out on both sides. Eventually, a truce was brokered. The castle held, but the cost was enormous. Sieges weren't just about battles. They were about suffering. Inside the walls, food ran out. People resorted to eating animals, leather, sometimes even worse. Outside the walls, besiegers faced disease, boredom, and the constant threat of a sally, a sudden attack by the defenders. It wasn't all swords and glory. Sometimes it was waiting, starving, and dying slowly. And yet, there were innovations. Medieval warfare wasn't stagnant. By the 14th and 15th centuries, gunpowder began creeping into European battlefields. Cannons, clumsy, heavy, and unreliable, began to appear. At first, They were more psychological than practical. The noise terrified horses. The idea of blasting through stone walls changed siege warfare forever. At the Battle of Castillon in 1453, often considered the final battle of the Hundred Years' War, the French used field artillery to devastating effect. The English, led by the aging John Talbot, charged a French camp fortified with cannons. Talbot expected a disorganized rabble. Instead, his men were torn apart by concentrated cannon fire. Talbot himself was killed. The English fled. Castillon wasn't just a battle. It was the death knell of an era. The age of plate-armored knights was ending. Gunpowder was the future. But what about those knights? Let's talk about their real role on the battlefield. Knights were trained from childhood, first as pages, then as squires, learning the arts of horsemanship, swordplay, and chivalry. But by the 13th century, chivalry was more an ideal than a reality. On the battlefield, knights weren't pristine figures rescuing damsels. They were armored tanks, charging into enemy lines, trying to create panic and break formations. In many cases, their effectiveness was limited by terrain or by the sheer number of infantry. Knights could dominate an open field, but in narrow streets or dense forests, they were vulnerable. And their armor? Effective but heavy. A full suit of plate could weigh 40 to 60 pounds. Knights needed help mounting their horses. If unhorsed, they were slow and awkward, easy targets for archers or pikemen. A determined foot soldier with a poleaxe could bring down a knight with a well-placed blow. This is where the idea of combined arms comes in. The most successful medieval commanders used a mix of troops: infantry to hold the line, archers to weaken the enemy, cavalry to exploit weaknesses. No single unit won battles alone. Coordination, terrain, and timing were everything. But even with perfect planning, medieval battles were always unpredictable. Why? Because they involved humans, tired, frightened, hungry humans, who didn't always follow orders, who fled when morale broke, who panicked at the first sight of blood. That's what gets lost in modern retellings. Medieval battles weren't elegant. They weren't chess games. They were unpredictable, emotional, brutal messes. Strategy mattered, yes, but so did the mood of a commander, the placement of a muddy field, the rumor that a king had fallen, or even the sound of an unfamiliar horn. They were won by courage, fear, deception, and chance. In our next part, we'll step even deeper into the personal side of warfare, what it felt like to be a soldier, how fear and trauma shaped survivors, and why some people kept coming back to the battlefield again and again, even knowing the horror that awaited. And we'll also peel back the myths that centuries of songs, poems, and Hollywood have built around the noble warrior. Stick with me. You haven't seen the worst of it yet. Let me know in the comments if you'd have survived Hastings or if you'd rather take your chances behind castle walls during a siege. What did it feel like to actually be there, in the chaos, stink, and screaming confusion of a medieval battlefield? Let's set aside the maps and the maneuvers for a moment and get close. Not as a king or knight, but as a foot soldier. An ordinary man, covered in sweat, grime, and fear, trying to stay alive in the middle of something no one really controlled. Imagine it. You're standing in formation, a spear in your hand. Your feet ache from the march. Your back is sore from hauling your kit. You haven't slept well in days. You're hungry, but not enough to vomit. Not yet. All around you, men are muttering prayers, checking weapons, staring blankly ahead. The guy next to you might be your neighbor, your brother, or a total stranger. You're all about to step into something that will change you forever if you survive. And then it begins. Not with a trumpet, not with a shouted order, but with a roar. Screams, hooves, arrows whistling through the air. The first wave hits, and your world becomes noise and metal. You don't remember your training, you just react. Your spear plunges forward, maybe it hits something soft. You feel something crash into your shield. Your arm goes numb. Mud flies into your eyes. Someone falls in front of you, and you trip over them. You scramble up and see your commander's banner. It's still there, thank God. You press forward. Minutes feel like hours. You swing your weapon more from instinct than aim. You're no hero. You're just trying not to die. This wasn't rare. This was standard. Most soldiers in medieval armies were not professionals. They were levies, free peasants summoned by their lord to fight. Many had no training. They used farming tools repurposed into weapons. They wore padded gambesons or old chainmail. If they were lucky, helmets were shared among families. Swords were rare. Spears and axes? Much more common. And most of them had never killed a man before. It's hard to explain the psychological effect of first blood. The moment someone near you screams, not like in the tavern, not like a play scream, but a real, gurgling, panic scream, and falls, spraying blood from a wound that shouldn't be possible. That moment breaks something inside you, or hardens it, or both. Many soldiers vomited or wet themselves in fear before or during their first battle. Some collapsed and were trampled by their own side. Others went berserk, screaming, foaming, hacking at anything that moved. That image of the calm, composed soldier? Rare. And when the line broke, when one side began to flee, things got even worse. You see, most deaths didn't happen in the main clash. They happened during the rout. When discipline collapsed and one army ran, the other pursued. And it wasn't pretty. Chasing men down from behind meant stabbing backs, cutting hamstrings, hacking at skulls. If you were fleeing and fell, you likely died on the ground, helpless, sobbing, crushed by horses or finished off by someone with an axe. No quarter was given unless you were worth ransoming. That's another cold reality. Ransoms were big business. A captured noble might fetch thousands of coins. Entire wars were extended just so captains could maximize the value of their prisoners. But if you were a nobody, a peasant, a squire, even a poor knight, you were usually left to die. Or worse, maimed. There are reports of men having their hands or noses cut off just for sport. And what about after the battle? The field was a horror show. Picture it. The bodies of horses, men, and dogs lying tangled in piles. Arms and legs hacked off. Entrails glistening in the sun. Blood soaking the ground. Crows circling overhead. Survivors crawling, screaming for water or mercy. Some men wandered for hours, concussed or stunned. Others looted the dead. They weren't dishonorable, they were survivors. Armor was valuable. Weapons could be sold. Even boots were worth stealing. One French chronicler described the field after Agincourt as a place where the devil danced. And the smell. Let's talk about the smell. The stench of blood, feces, ruptured stomachs, and death would linger for days. Anyone walking the field would gag. There are accounts of even seasoned knights breaking down and weeping. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't noble. It was trauma, on a scale modern minds struggle to grasp. And the wounds? Medieval medicine was not equipped to handle the damage done by axes, maces, and arrows. A soldier with a deep cut might die days later from infection. A pierced lung? Fatal. Broken bones? Good luck healing without splints or antibiotics. Many soldiers who survived were left permanently disabled. Lost fingers, ears, eyes. Lame legs. And the psychological scars, what we now call PTSD, were as real then as now. Men came home different, unable to sleep, flinching at loud noises, haunted by what they'd seen. And yet, they went back. Again and again. Why? Sometimes it was duty. A call from a lord or king. Other times it was for money or land or the promise of loot. In a world where famine and disease were common, war could actually be seen as an opportunity. And for some, it became an identity. Mercenaries, like the infamous routiers in France or the condottieri in Italy, were professional soldiers who fought for pay. They weren't noble. They were ruthless, skilled, and feared. They fought for whoever paid best, and they left towns in ashes if they weren't paid at all. A mercenary might spend decades in armor, fighting across Europe. Some became wealthy. Most died young. All of them lived closer to death than we can imagine. Now, let's pause and consider the commanders. Leading a medieval army wasn't easy. It involved coordinating thousands of men without modern communication. Orders were shouted or signaled by flags or horns. Confusion was common. Friendly fire happened. Whole units got lost or routed without warning. And yet, some men stood out. Edward III of England, for example, showed remarkable battlefield control at Crécy in 1346. He trusted his commanders and let his son, the Black Prince, lead a flank at age 16. He watched from a windmill on a hill, not cowardice, but clarity. From there, he saw the field. He made decisions. He won. Or Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, Scotland's iconic victory against England. Outnumbered and outmatched, Bruce used terrain and discipline to destroy a larger force. He positioned his schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, in the narrow spaces between woods and marshes, negating English cavalry. It worked. The English panicked. Many drowned in retreat. Bannockburn became a symbol of Scottish resistance. But not all leaders were brilliant. Some were fools. At the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, French knights, drunk on pride, charged a Flemish infantry force without coordination. They got bogged down in the marshy fields and were slaughtered. Hundreds of noblemen died. It was called the Battle of the Golden Spurs because so many French spurs were taken as trophies. Arrogance killed just as many as arrows. And while all this was happening, the church watched with mixed feelings. On one hand, violence between Christians was frowned upon, at least officially. On the other, the Crusades were not only blessed, they were celebrated. A soldier who died fighting in the Holy Land was promised forgiveness and eternal life. The sword became a sacred instrument. But even on these holy battlefields, cruelty reigned. At the Siege of Antioch, 1097 to 1098, Crusaders slaughtered not just Muslim defenders, but fellow Christians suspected of aiding the enemy. Cannibalism was reported, whether out of desperation or madness. Eyewitnesses described starving soldiers roasting corpses. Whether the stories are true or exaggerated, the terror was real. And then there's the children. Yes, children were sometimes caught in the war machine, not just as victims, but as participants. Pages and squires followed their lords into battle. Camp followers, families of soldiers, traveled with armies. Young boys were sometimes used as messengers, scouts, even combatants. At the Battle of Poitiers, the teenage Black Prince commanded troops. Joan of Arc led men at 17. War had no age restrictions in the Middle Ages. If you could hold a weapon, you could die holding it. And let's not forget the women. Though rarely in direct combat, women played critical roles. Some defended castles, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda of Tuscany. Others nursed the wounded, ran supplies, or protected homes during campaigns. And when cities were sacked, women often suffered the most. Rape was a constant threat. So was forced labor. Some were taken as hostages or slaves. Others were killed out of hand. In war, no one was truly safe. So why do we romanticize it? Why do we imagine brave knights charging into glory, banners waving, trumpets blaring? Because the truth is too much. Because the real medieval battlefield was mud, panic, screams, and fire. It was a place where humans did unspeakable things to each other, and then tried to forget. But we shouldn't forget. We should remember, clearly, honestly. In Part 4, we'll dive into the myths that arose after the fact. How songs, poems, and kings turned horror into legend. How the medieval battlefield was cleaned up, not just in body, but in memory. And we'll look at what's left of those fields today. Ruins, graves, whispers in the earth. Ready? Let's finish this together in the final chapter. Let me know in the comments what moment shocked you the most, or what you'd like to learn about medieval warfare that we haven't covered yet. And if you're still with me, you're made of stern stuff. It's strange, isn't it? How something so brutal, so chaotic and scarring, could become the stuff of bedtime stories, epic poems, stained glass windows, and romance. We ended Part 3 amid the mud and blood of a real battlefield. But in this final chapter, we're stepping back, not away from the truth, but into the aftermath, the memory, the myth-making. Because what actually happened in a medieval battle was often rewritten by those who needed the story to serve them. Let's start with the chroniclers. The average medieval soldier was illiterate. But the monks, clerics, and scribes who wrote history, they had ink, parchment, and a purpose. And that purpose was rarely neutrality. A battle won by their king became a miracle. The enemy's failure was God's judgment. Omens were inserted. The number of fallen was inflated or downplayed depending on the audience. One chronicler might say 10,000 died, another just 500. Both might be lying. These were not neutral historians. They were propagandists, building legacies. Consider the famous Battle of Hastings in 1066. We all know the image. King Harold struck in the eye by a Norman arrow, collapsing as William the Conqueror seizes the English crown. But wait, was he really shot in the eye? The Bayeux Tapestry shows a figure with an arrow near his face, then another scene of a man being cut down by a sword. Are they the same man? Is it Harold? Did the Normans edit the story? We don't know. But what we do know is that the tapestry, commissioned by Normans, told the story they wanted told. The clean story. the victorious story, not the messy reality of arrows fired into the air, chaos, friendly fire, screaming. Even the holy wars, the Crusades, were mythologized almost instantly. Leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon and Richard the Lionheart were turned into saints, heroes, legends. Songs were written, relics gathered, bones blessed. But what about the sieges, the starvation, the mass killings? Brushed aside. Not holy, not heroic. Truth, in medieval war, became secondary to symbol. And the symbols were everywhere. Shining armor, gallant knights, maidens watching from towers, chivalry. But let's interrogate that word for a moment, chivalry. Chivalry wasn't a universal code. It was an ideal, written mostly by poets and noblemen, designed to make war seem noble. Protect the weak. Respect your enemies. Fight with honor. But in practice, chivalry broke like glass when blood was spilled. Knights were known to break their oaths, pillage churches, burn villages, rape, torture. When a castle refused to surrender, the code often flipped. No mercy to the stubborn. So what did chivalry really mean? It meant protecting your class, your status, your peers. A knight might ransom another knight, but cut down a peasant without blinking. Honor was a currency, not a shield. Now, let's fast forward a few years, sometimes just days, after a major battle. Once the dead were buried, or left to rot, the political cleanup began. Kings needed to justify their actions to the nobility and the church. They needed to show that the battle wasn't just necessary, it was just. So sermons were delivered, coins were minted, monuments were built, chronicles were written, framing the events in divine light. A crushing defeat, blamed on weather or treachery, or the sins of the people. A great victory, proof of divine favor. The battle wasn't just remembered, it was reinvented. And the men who fought in it, most went home, if they could. Some returned with coin or loot, others with broken bodies. Many had no choice but to fight again. Wars rarely ended in peace, they ended in pauses. But the memory of battle lived on, in their minds and, increasingly, in song. Minstrels and troubadours turned the battlefield into theater. They sang of valiant charges, last stands, duels between noble foes. Names like Roland, Arthur, and El Cid became larger than life. The stinking horror of war was cleaned, perfumed, and offered to the masses. Even peasants, who had seen the terror firsthand, found comfort in the idea that it meant something, that their suffering wasn't meaningless, that their sons didn't die for nothing. This wasn't naivety, it was survival. Turning trauma into story is how humans cope. We shape horror into heroism because the alternative, accepting the randomness, the cruelty, is unbearable. And so, the legend grew. Knights became the model for nobility. Heraldry, once practical, became ceremonial. Tournaments replaced true combat. Mock battles that echoed the real thing, but without the risk. Armor became more ornate, less functional. War became pageant. But real war never stopped. While the songs praised honor, real soldiers still hacked each other apart in muddy fields. Take the Wars of the Roses, for example. Two branches of the English royal family tearing each other apart for decades. The battles were small compared to earlier conflicts, but the politics were vicious. Executions followed defeats. Children were orphaned. Towns burned. Yet even here, romance intruded. The story of Richard III, for instance, was reshaped after his death. Shakespeare portrayed him as a hunchbacked villain, desperate and evil. But the real man? Complicated, brave, possibly even popular in his time. His final charge at Bosworth was suicidal, but perhaps noble. But facts didn't matter. The victor, Henry VII, needed a scapegoat. So Richard became a monster in the history books. Another example of how truth bends to power. So what's left today? Some battlefields are lost, paved over, forgotten. Others are preserved. Museums, memorials, grassy fields dotted with signs. Go to Agincourt or Bannockburn and you'll find plaques, maybe a visitor center. You can walk where they fought, stand where thousands screamed, listen to the wind and imagine. But the real legacy is quieter. It's in the family names that trace back to survivors. It's in the old ballads passed from voice to voice. It's in the trauma that echoed down generations. And maybe most of all, it's in the stories we still tell. The movies, the books, the games, the fantasy of the knight, the draw of the sword, the myth that violence can be noble, Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We haven't really changed. We still romanticize war. We still dress it up in uniforms, medals, ceremonies. We honor courage, and we should, but we mustn't forget the cost. The stinking, sobbing, soul-breaking cost. What actually happened in a medieval battle wasn't glory. It wasn't destiny. It was chaos, violence, trauma, survival. It was people, real people, hurting each other because someone else told them to. But out of that pain, we shaped legends. And those legends shaped the world. So next time you see a knight in shining armor, or hear a tale of gallant war, remember, behind every myth is a man, scared and sweating in a field of mud, trying not to die. And maybe, just maybe, trying to understand why he was there at all. Thank you for joining me on this 4-part journey. If you made it this far, you're one of the few who truly stuck through the blood, the grime, and the hard truths. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most? What broke your heart? What made you think differently? And if you'd like more uncomfortable, honest history, well, you know what to do. Until next time, rest easy. And remember the past, not for what we wish it was, but for what it truly was. Imagine waking up to the sound of your thatched roof caving in under snow, your breath visible in the air, your stomach gnawing with hunger, and the only thing you're sure of is that today might end with your clan raiding the next valley, where there's raiding you. Scotland. Wild. Windswept. Romanticized in postcards and movies with sweeping vistas and bagpipes echoing across lonely glens. But let's rip the tartan off that fantasy, because medieval Scotland was no fairy tale. From the 12th to the 15th centuries, life here was short, hard, and brutally uncertain. Whether you were a Highlander scratching out a living from rocky soil or a burger merchant in the storm-battered lowland towns, one thing united almost everyone: suffering. Let's begin at the base of society, the peasantry. Roughly 90% of Scotland's medieval population were common folk: farmers, crofters, fishers, shepherds, and laborers. And most of them lived in turf houses. Not quaint cottages, damp, dark, one-room shacks with a peat fire in the middle and a hole in the roof for smoke. Floors were often just packed earth. Livestock might sleep inside with the family for warmth. The smell? A mingling of sweat, manure, smoke, wet wool, and whatever was fermenting in a wooden bucket. Winter was the enemy. It wasn't just cold. It was deadly. Crops failed. Roads turned to mud. Herds were culled or lost. A bad harvest could mean starvation, no exaggeration. And in medieval Scotland, bad harvests came often. The land, though hauntingly beautiful, was rarely forgiving. The climate was colder and wetter than today, especially during the Little Ice Age, which gripped Europe from the 14th century onward. Fields flooded. Winds tore thatch from roofs. Snow cut off mountain passes. Malnutrition wasn't rare, it was normal. What did people eat? Mostly oats and barley. Porridge. Oatcakes. Sometimes kale or turnips. If you were lucky, maybe a smoked herring or a scrap of mutton from a slaughtered sheep too sick to survive the winter. Fresh meat was rare. Salt was precious. And when sickness struck, there was no help coming. Let's talk about medicine, or rather, its medieval Scottish equivalent. Doctors were few. Most healing was done by folk remedies passed orally from generation to generation. Herbal knowledge was strong. Heather, nettles, rowan, and bog myrtle were used for everything from toothaches to fevers. But when the plague came, herbs weren't enough. The Black Death hit Scotland hard in 1349. It came late compared to England, but spread quickly. Villages were wiped out. Entire kin groups vanished. Corpses rotted in shallow pits. And for many survivors, the horror never left. There were no antibiotics, no sanitation. Infection from a minor cut could kill you. Teeth rotted early. Blindness from smoke exposure or untreated eye infections was common. Lice, fleas, and intestinal worms were just part of life. But physical hardship was only one side of the brutality. The other came from people, your fellow Scots. This was a fractured land. Scotland wasn't a unified kingdom in the way we think of countries today. It was more a patchwork of clans, feudal lords, and competing kings, all with shifting loyalties and blood feuds older than memory. In the Highlands, society was ruled by clan structures, tight-knit kin groups that often had more loyalty to their chieftain than to any king in Edinburgh. If your clan was strong, you had protection. If weak, you were prey. Raiding neighboring glens wasn't just a pastime, it was a way to survive. Cattle were life. And stealing cattle? That was warfare. Not in the grand sense of armies and banners, but sudden violence, flaming torches at midnight, screaming children, stolen beasts driven into the hills. These reaving raids were constant. In the borders, especially from the 13th century onward, life was worse still. This was the no man's land between England and Scotland, where law had no grip and loyalty shifted like wind. The infamous border reavers were families who lived by thieving, raiding, and revenge. Murder, arson, kidnapping for ransom commonplace. If your home was burned, there was little justice. You retaliated or perished. Feud and counterfeud turned entire regions into low-grade war zones. And the central government? Practically non-existent in these regions. The king's authority was weak, especially when the throne itself was constantly being contested. Speaking of kings, Scotland's royalty wasn't exactly a stabilizing force. In the late 13th and 14th centuries, Scotland was plunged into the wars of independence. Think of names like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, heroes today, but then, just men fighting in a brutal, grinding war against English invasion. The violence was horrific. Edward I of England, the Hammer of the Scots, launched invasion after invasion. Castles were besieged, towns burned, civilians slaughtered. Wallace himself was executed by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The fate of the common people? Famine, disease, displacement. And even when Bruce won at Bannockburn in 1314, peace was a dream. The country was shattered. Fields lay fallow. Bandits roamed freely. And infighting returned with a vengeance. By the time the 15th century arrived, most Scots lived under constant threat, from nature, from nobles, from their neighbors, from hunger. Even religion couldn't shield you. The church was powerful but not always comforting. Tithes were demanded whether you were starving or not. Bishops lived in luxury while villagers buried their children in unmarked graves. And spiritual terror was real. Heaven, hell, and purgatory were preached with fire and certainty. To sin was to risk eternal torment. And sin was everywhere. A woman with too much knowledge of herbs? A suspected witch? A man who questioned a priest? A heretic? Punishments could be cruel, public humiliation, mutilation, or death. Meanwhile, noble families feuded constantly, dragging their vassals into conflicts that meant little to them. Men-at-arms roamed the countryside. And if your lord declared war on another, you picked up a weapon, or were branded a coward. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years. And if you were born poor, your chances of escaping that fate were almost non-existent. But despite all this, despite the hunger, fear, cold, violence people endured, songs were still sung, stories still told, children still born, weddings still celebrated under windblown trees or stone kirks. And belief, deep, rooted belief in the land and family, in the old ways, kept people going. Because for the medieval Scot, the brutality of life wasn't a tragedy. It was normal. It was the way of the world. And you faced it with your kin at your back, your name on your tongue, and your courage stitched into your bones. If you thought a medieval Scottish winter was unforgiving, wait until you learn what happened when someone stole a sheep, or worse, insulted someone's honor. In these lands, justice didn't come from courts. It came from the edge of a blade, in the dark, with no warning. Now, lean back, close your eyes, and let's return to medieval Scotland, where life was brutal, not just because of nature, but because of people. We ended last time with the people enduring. But let's be clear, not everyone endured equally. In medieval Scotland, the word justice meant something very different depending on your social class and your clan. Let's start with the idea of clan justice. In theory, Scotland had a growing legal system. From the 12th century onward, kings like David I and James I tried to centralize law with courts, sheriffs, royal decrees, and recorded cases. But for the average person, especially in the Highlands or borders, these laws might as well have been written in Latin on the moon. What really ruled the people was honor. Clan honor, family honor, personal honor. If you were wronged, it wasn't a question of whether the sheriff could help. It was, what will your kin do about it? Say someone from Clan MacDonald insults a MacLeod. Maybe he calls him a coward. Maybe he spits at him in front of others. Maybe he touches his wife's hand a little too long. That might be enough to set off decades of blood feud. Clan feuds weren't about laws or logic. They were about pride, power, and precedent. Once a feud began, it was a chain reaction. One killing led to another, then maybe a house burned, then cattle stolen, and on and on. You could be born into a feud started before your grandfather was born, and it could still get you killed. Sometimes, entire clans were nearly wiped out. A famous example? The Massacre of Glencoe, 1692. It happened after our period, but it reveals the underlying mindset. The Campbells, acting on orders from the Crown, killed 38 MacDonalds in their sleep after having accepted their hospitality for days. It was treachery, blood-soaked, and cold. But in clan politics, it was also just the brutal end to a long-standing enmity. Even in peacetime, justice was savage. If you were caught stealing a horse, a cow, even something as small as a knife, you might be hanged on the spot. No trial, no defense. You could be tied to a tree and strangled with a rope. Executions were public and often gruesome. Mutilation was common. Thieves might lose fingers. Adulterers might be branded or shaved bald. In some regions, a woman accused of promiscuity might have her nose cut off. Yes, her nose. And forget prison as we understand it. Medieval Scotland didn't have a robust prison system. If someone was imprisoned, it was usually a noble, held in a castle dungeon, not because they were guilty, but to extract ransom or force political surrender. For commoners, punishment was immediate, corporal, and scarring. And let's talk about women for a moment, because their lives were even more restricted. Medieval Scottish women had almost no legal independence. A woman's life was ruled by men, her father, her brother, her husband. If she married, everything she owned became her husband's. If her husband died, and she didn't remarry quickly, she could be left destitute, forced to beg, work as a servant, or turn to desperate measures. Women could not vote, could not serve in legal courts, and could not inherit most property unless they had no brothers. Even then, their guardians usually arranged for that property to pass to a husband. And if a woman accused a man of violence, good luck. The burden of proof was on her. If a man was from a higher status clan or had more armed relatives, she might be punished for even making the accusation. But the hardest fate often fell on widows and daughters of disgraced clans. If your family lost a feud or displeased a noble, your land was seized and your name dishonored. Some women were forced into convents, not for piety, but to remove them from the bloodline. Now let's shift to the social hierarchy, because medieval Scotland was not an equal place. At the top sat the nobility, the mormaers, later called earls, barons, lairds, and knights. These men lived in stone tower houses or castles and had private armies of retainers. Their wealth came from land and the peasants who worked it. Below them were the lesser gentry and freemen, tenants who farmed land but owed rent or service. They had some mobility and might rise in wealth or influence, but remained firmly beneath the nobility. Below them were the cotters, crofters, and bonded tenants, peasants with limited rights, some of whom were barely above serfdom. Their lives were dictated by the land they worked and the lord who claimed it. And then there were the outlaws, vagrants, and unland poor, people who owned nothing, owed everything, and were one failed harvest away from death. These were the people you passed in silence on a road. People you didn't make eye contact with, because sometimes desperation turned them dangerous. And let's not forget about the Gaelic-speaking Highlanders versus the Scots-speaking Lowlanders. These weren't just regional accents, they were different worlds. The Highlands clung to older Celtic traditions, oral law, clan loyalty, raiding culture, and even dress. The Lowlands, meanwhile, were increasingly influenced by Anglo-Norman customs with structured feudal systems, towns, burghs, and market economies. This created tension. Lowlanders viewed Highlanders as savages, unwashed, unruly, and violent. Highlanders saw Lowlanders as soft, foreign, and disloyal to the old ways. These divisions would only deepen over time, but even in the medieval period, they caused clashes. In fact, some Scottish kings feared the Highlands more than the English. Take James I, who reigned in the early 1400s. He was murdered by a faction of Highland nobles after trying to crack down on their power. His successors waged campaigns against rebellious chieftains. The bloodshed was staggering, and there was the church, powerful, rich, and often corrupt. While monks did preserve learning and offer some charity, many clerics were political agents. Bishops owned vast lands. Abbots controlled armies of laborers. And the spiritual needs of the common folk? Often ignored. Confession, penance, indulgences, these were used more for control than compassion. A man might be told to pay silver to absolve his sins, while his children starved. And yes, there were witch trials, even in medieval Scotland. Though they became more infamous in the 16th and 17th centuries, suspicions existed long before. A healer whose potion failed, a midwife at a stillbirth, an old woman living alone. Any of these could become a scapegoat during a bad winter. But here's the strange thing. Even amid all this brutality, people believed in God, in their saints. in their clan, in the turning of the year, in the old festivals. They found meaning in tiny joys, a successful harvest, a warm fire, a child's first steps, a wedding where no one was killed. These weren't weak people. They were hardened by necessity, trained by suffering, and driven by an unshakable connection to their land and their lineage. But let's not mistake endurance for peace. In medieval Scotland, peace was a fragile illusion, a pause between storms, not the absence of them. One wrong word could cost a life. One failed alliance could doom a village. One raiding party could burn a season's worth of labor to ashes. There were no police, no ambulance, no help coming over the hill. If your world caught fire, your only hope was your kin or your sword. And as the 15th century bled into the 16th, Scotland's problems were only just beginning. Because soon, religion would fracture. Nobles would grasp for more power. Foreign influence would grow. And the everyday people, the ones who had endured so much, would be caught once again in a storm they didn't ask for. What did it feel like to wake up every morning in medieval Scotland, knowing that one wrong move, one unlucky cough, or one cold winter could end your life or the life of someone you love? Let's begin with something that governed every waking hour: food. In modern life, you might complain if a pizza delivery is late. In medieval Scotland, food wasn't just a convenience, it was a daily gamble. The typical Scottish peasant lived on what could be grown, foraged, or bartered locally. That meant a diet built around barley, oats, root vegetables, kale, and peas. Meat was rare for most. When it was eaten, it came from salted pork, smoked fish, or, if you were lucky, a hen that stopped laying eggs. Fresh meat? A luxury, reserved for the nobility or festivals. Cows were too valuable alive. Sheep meant wool. Chickens gave eggs. Killing them had to be worth the loss. There were no supermarkets. If a crop failed, if hail came at the wrong time, or early frost wiped out your barley, you didn't just eat less. You starved. The winter months, called the hunger months by some, were the real test. Imagine you've got a sack of oats, a few turnips left from the root cellar, and maybe a little salted fish if rats haven't gotten to it. You mix oats with water into a thin gruel. That's breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a week. And then it runs out. You can try boiling leather or chewing bark. You can try stealing. But if you're caught, well, we covered what happens to thieves. Malnutrition wasn't an exception, it was normal. Children grew slowly. Teeth fell out early. Bones healed wrong. Rickets bent legs, and scurvy blackened gums. And yet they survived. Somehow. Their homes, too, were built for survival, barely. A typical dwelling for a peasant was a cruck house, made of timber frames, walls packed with wattle and daub, woven branches covered in mud and dung, and a thatched roof that leaked constantly. There were no chimneys. The fire pit was in the center of the room. Smoke filled the air and seeped out through the roof or a small hole. You lived in that smoke, breathed it, slept in it. Babies were born in it. There was no glass on windows, just wooden shutters, if that. In winter, you plugged gaps with straw or animal skins. When it rained, and it often did, everything was damp. Clothes, beds, blankets. Mold was your constant companion. The floor? Dirt. Cold and alive with fleas. Lice lived in your hair. Rats scurried underfoot. You might share your house with pigs or chickens, especially during winter. Why? Because they gave off body heat, and you needed every bit. The idea of privacy didn't exist. One room, one bed if you were lucky, shared by parents, children, and sometimes neighbors or cousins. Marriages were consummated inches from sleeping siblings. Deaths happened with infants watching. And yet, in these smoky, squalid rooms, life went on. Stories were told. Songs were sung. Children were born and old women whispered cures by firelight. Clothing, too, was more about survival than fashion. Most people owned one or two sets of clothes made from wool. Underwear, if it existed, was linen and reserved for wealthier folk. Dyes were expensive, so most clothing was brown, gray, or dull green. Your tunic doubled as your blanket. Your cloak was everything: a windbreaker, a rain shield, a mattress. Shoes were often leather, stuffed with straw in winter. Washing clothes was rare. Washing yourself? Even rarer. Baths were laborious, and hot water was precious. Most folk washed hands and faces occasionally, but went months, sometimes years, without a full bath. The result? The stink was staggering. Everyone smelled. Clothes reeked of smoke, sweat, animals, and unwashed skin. But you didn't notice, because everything else did too. And it wasn't just the body that needed protection, it was the soul. You see, Medieval Scots weren't just brutalized by nature and men, they lived in constant fear of the invisible. Superstition ruled daily life. If your child grew sick, maybe a fairy had taken them and left a changeling in their place. If your cow gave sour milk, maybe your jealous neighbor cursed it with the evil eye. People wore charms, carried iron for protection, marked doorways with symbols to ward off spirits. Sleep was dangerous. That's when the Bean-Nigh, the washing woman of the dead, might be seen near rivers, cleaning the clothes of someone about to die. And then there were the church teachings. Hellfire, damnation, purgatory. The priest warned that your every action might send you to eternal torment. And with famine, plague, and war at your doorstep, damnation felt very close. What about medicine? If you got sick, your options were limited and terrifying. Healers existed, wise women, monks, midwives. They used herbs, poultices, prayers. Some remedies worked. Many didn't. If you had a fever, they might try bleeding you. If you had a toothache, they might yank the tooth with iron pliers, no painkillers. Wounds often turned septic. Infections spread fast. There were no antibiotics, no concept of germs. If your leg broke, it might be set badly. If it got infected, it might be amputated, without anesthetic, with whatever blade was at hand. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death among women. There were no hospitals, no sterilization, just a cold room, a blood-stained sheet, and prayers. Still, amidst all this suffering, there was resilience. The Scots had festivals, music, dancing, beliefs that stitched joy into the seams of their daily struggle. Beltane, on May 1st, marked the return of the sun. Fires were lit on hillsides. Couples leapt over flames for fertility. Cattle were driven between bonfires to purify them. Samhain, on October 31st, honored the dead in the thinning veil between worlds. It was a time of ghosts and offerings, and it eventually gave birth to Halloween. These celebrations were more than ritual. They were rebellion. Against the cold. Against fear. Against the crushing weight of survival. And there was storytelling. Scots have always loved stories. By the hearth, elders told tales of warriors, monsters, saints, and devils. Oral tradition kept history alive, because for most people, there were no books, no literacy. Bards and poets were honored guests. A good story could bring laughter, or tears, or warning. Legends like William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, or the mythical Selkies gave hope. They reminded people that heroes rose from the mud, that one person could make a difference. That mattered, because the average person had no power. The nobility fought for land and titles. The church fought for control of your soul. But the poor? They fought for breakfast. Still, every now and then, they did fight back. Peasant uprisings were rare but fierce. When rents became too high, when lords grew too greedy, sometimes villages burned manor houses. Sometimes a sheriff disappeared. Sometimes entire regions refused to pay taxes. It rarely ended well. The crown crushed rebellion with brutal force. Rebels were hanged, drawn, quartered, their bodies displayed on spikes. But the spirit behind those rebellions never died. It lingered in the songs, the stories, the stubbornness that defined the Scottish soul. And let's not forget that life wasn't just local. There were foreign threats too. England. Always England. Raids, invasions, skirmishes. The southern border was a battleground. Armies marched through villages, taking food, burning homes, conscripting boys. A peaceful season could end overnight with the sound of hivs and shouting. But even beyond the English threat, the medieval Scottish world was full of instability. One king died, another rose. Noble families jostled for power. One year you owed allegiance to one lord, the next to his enemy. Allegiances changed like the weather. If you were on the losing side, your land could be seized, your kin hunted. But the people, the farmers, the crofters, the shepherds, they kept going. Planting, harvesting, praying, hoping. Because what else could they do? There was no escape. You were born into your village, your name, your clan. And for most, you died there too. But if you're imagining these people as sad, broken souls, you're wrong. They were tough, yes, weathered. But there was laughter too. There was community. Children still played. Lovers still kissed in secret places. Old men still carved wooden spoons and told tales of wars no one remembered. Even in the most brutal world, humanity finds a way to shine through. Still, the shadow of change loomed. The medieval world of Scotland was ending. A new era of fire and turmoil was coming. The Reformation, the rise of the crown's absolute power, the destruction of old clan systems, it would all come like a tidal wave. And when it did, the brutality wouldn't vanish. It would evolve. By the late Middle Ages, Scotland stood at a crossroads. The brutality hadn't disappeared, it had simply begun to wear a different face. The clan system, once the backbone of Highland life, was becoming unstable. These kin-based societies had kept order in a lawless land for centuries. Every man knew his place. Every family knew its loyalties. Chiefs provided protection in exchange for obedience. In return, you offered service in war, labor in peace, and fealty until death. But cracks were forming. Increasingly, the lowlands and the highlands were drifting apart economically, culturally, politically. The lowlands embraced feudal norms, trading with Europe, absorbing influence from England and France. The highlands clung to tradition, Gaelic language, clan allegiance, pastoral life, and oral law. To the English, Highlanders were wild, primitive. To the lowland Scots, they were a political liability. The result? When the Scottish crown began to centralize power, the Highland clans were seen as obstacles. One moment you were a respected clan leader. The next, you were branded a rebel, a bandit, a traitor. And yet the clan system endured until modernity came to break it. But let's return to the landscape, because it too was a brutalizing force. Scotland's geography isn't just beautiful, it's punishing. Jagged mountains, endless bogs, harsh winds from the North Sea, narrow glens that trap cold air and shadow. Travel between villages could take days, even if they were only 20 miles apart. Roads were muddy tracks. Bridges were rare. Snow and ice in winter made travel nearly impossible. And yet people did it, on foot, with pack animals, and cloaks stiff with frost. Merchants braved mountain passes. Priests crossed moors to deliver last rites. Messengers galloped through misty forests to warn of invading forces. Every journey was a risk. Bandits, wolves, sudden storms. If you slipped off a cliff or broke an ankle far from home, you might never be found. Now imagine living your whole life in such isolation. No news, no letters, no printed books. The outside world came to you only when it wanted something: taxes, soldiers, allegiance. This physical isolation bred a kind of mental one too. Each valley, each glen, had its own customs, accents, myths. A village 30 miles away might seem as foreign as a kingdom across the sea. Still, these isolated communities developed powerful internal cultures. Music, dance, craftsmanship, oral history. But isolation also meant vulnerability. When plague returned, again and again, it came like a ghost, cutting through settlements, then vanishing back into the hills. The Black Death struck Scotland in 1349, hitting towns and countryside alike. Some Highland villages were said to have lost all inhabitants, the fires burning down in hearths with no hands left to tend them. Those who survived found their world even more unstable. Labor shortages after plague years gave some peasants a little bargaining power. They could demand better rents, more freedom. But landowners didn't like that. Laws were passed to freeze wages, tie workers to estates, criminalize vagrancy. And when workers fled, seeking freedom, better life, they were hunted, captured, punished. For a time, trying to improve your life could mean being branded, shackled, or mutilated. And then came religious change, violent, messy, irreversible. The Scottish Reformation in the 16th century shattered centuries of Catholic tradition. Monasteries were dissolved. Churches were stripped. Latin vanished. The new Kirk, the Protestant Church of Scotland, preached austerity, discipline, and strict morality. For ordinary people, this was confusing, terrifying, and dangerous. Where once the Virgin Mary smiled down from every chapel, now her statues were smashed. Saints were denounced as false idols. Holy days disappeared. Priests married. Monks vanished. Imagine your entire life shaped by feast days, sacraments, and sacred relics, and suddenly they're illegal. Worse, if you refused to conform, you were labeled a heretic. Some were fined, others whipped. A few were executed, burned, strangled, or hanged. And the Kirk watched everything. Ministers reported gossip. Elders investigated behavior. Dancing on a Sunday? Punishable. Swearing? Fined. Missing church? Suspicious. In some areas, even naming your child something too Catholic could raise eyebrows. This was religious brutality, not with swords, but with shame. And yet, like everything in Scotland's history, it was complicated. The Reformation gave some Scots new power. Ordinary people read the Bible. New schools were founded. The seed of literacy was planted, and with it, resistance. Still, brutality persisted. Witch hunts swept through Scotland in waves, especially between 1560 and 1700. Thousands of women, and some men, were accused of consorting with the devil. What made you a witch? Being too poor, too old, too outspoken. Midwives were targeted. Healers, widows, anyone who stood outside the norm. Once accused, it was nearly impossible to prove your innocence. You might be stripped, searched for devil's marks, pricked with needles, sleep deprived, tortured, forced to confess. Then, you'd be strangled and burned. These were public events. The community watched. Children attended. The message was clear: conform or burn. And all of this, the religious fear, the witch trials, the loss of ancient rights, happened while political storms raged above. The Scottish monarchy was forever in crisis. Kings murdered, overthrown, exiled. Queens beheaded. Regents ruled in chaos. The people on the ground didn't choose these wars, but they paid for them in taxes, in conscription, in burned farms and ruined crops. During the reign of James VI, the crown cracked down harder than ever on the clans. Powerful families were disarmed, castles demolished, chiefs imprisoned or executed. Gaelic culture was viewed as backwards, pagan, dangerous. Some chiefs submitted. Others rebelled. Some fled to Ireland. Others turned pirate. But one by one, the old orders fell. And yet, Scotland remained unyielding. Even as modernity approached, even as Enlightenment thinkers wrote from Edinburgh salons, much of the country still lived by ancient rhythms. By the early 1700s, entire regions of the Highlands still spoke only Gaelic, still told the same stories, still believed in omens, in spirits, in honor. But the final blow was coming. The Jacobite risings, especially the disaster of 1745, marked the end of Highland resistance. The Battle of Culloden in 1746 wasn't just a military defeat. It was cultural obliteration. In the years that followed, British forces enacted ruthless suppression. Clan tartans were banned. Bagpipes were outlawed. Gaelic was discouraged. Chiefs were stripped of land and titles. Survivors were executed or exiled. Soldiers burned homes. Families were scattered. Those left behind were impoverished, humiliated. The Highland clearances soon followed, continuing into the 19th century. Landowners, many Scottish themselves, evicted thousands to make room for sheep farming. Entire villages vanished. Families forced onto boats. Others walked for days to coastal slums or immigrated to Canada, America, Australia. It was the final twist in a long, brutal story. A people shaped by hardship, betrayed by their own leaders, and scattered by history. But here's the strange truth. Despite all of this, Scotland endured. The songs survived, even when outlawed. The stories were whispered. The language clung on in isolated glens and islands. The spirit never fully broke. And today, when you walk through the Highlands, through ruined castles and windswept heather, you can feel it. The memory of a people who didn't just endure brutality, they turned it into identity. It's in the defiance, the pride, the sharp wit and dark humor, the loyalty, the fierce sense of place. Medieval Scotland was brutal, yes, but it was also beautifully stubborn. And that stubbornness, that refusal to be erased, is what carried the Scottish soul through centuries of hardship. It's what still echoes, faintly, in every drone of the bagpipe, every Gaelic lullaby, every castle stone. It's what reminds us that even the most brutal life can leave behind something unforgettable. Have you ever wished you were born centuries ago, strolling through spice-scented bazaars and lounging in marble hammams, living like a sultan or a mysterious palace dancer? Sounds magical, right? Well, hold that thought. Because behind the silks and scimitars, life in the Ottoman Empire could be absolutely miserable for most people, filthy, dangerous, unpredictable, and completely beyond your control. The Ottoman Empire was massive, stretching at its height from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Baghdad. For over 600 years, it dominated the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. But if you lived under its rule, your daily life wasn't shaped by grandeur. It was shaped by grime, fear, and rigid control. Let's begin with the basics. You didn't own your own life. If you were born male, you were likely seen as labor. If you were born female, you were either a future bride, a future servant, or someone's future property. And if you were born in a province, away from the wealthy urban centers like Istanbul or Bursa, you were probably a peasant, grinding out survival in a dusty field, worrying about taxes, drought, disease, and corrupt officials. But even if you were born in the capital, don't get too excited. The glittering heart of the empire was beautiful from afar, domes and minarets, golden crescents catching the sun. But step into a back alley, and you'd find narrow, muddy streets filled with open sewage, stray dogs, desperate beggars, and food carts covered in flies. The Ottoman legal system, called canon, when it wasn't based on Islamic law, Sharia, was complex and brutal. Punishments were harsh, often public, and wildly inconsistent. A minor theft might get your hand cut off. Gossiping about the Sultan? Execution. Refusing military conscription? Torture and death. And no, there was no such thing as a fair trial, not if you weren't wealthy, powerful, or well-connected. The local judge, Cuddy, might take bribes. Evidence was usually hearsay. Accusations of heresy, sedition, or witchcraft could end your life on the spot. Religious minorities, Jews, Christians, Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, were tolerated but marginalized. They were second-class citizens, required to pay the jizya tax just for existing under Muslim rule. They couldn't bear arms. They couldn't ride horses in some places. They wore specific clothing to mark their status. In theory, they were protected as people of the book. In practice, that protection was fragile. Mobs could be incited. Entire communities were sometimes uprooted or persecuted depending on the mood of a local governor or the rumors of the moment. But even being Muslim didn't guarantee safety. The empire's vast bureaucracy needed loyalty above all else. One wrong word, one enemy's whisper, one careless comment about the Sultan or his court, and you could vanish overnight. Speaking of vanishing, let's talk about the Devshirme. If you were a young Christian boy in the Balkans between the 14th and 17th centuries, you lived in constant fear of Ottoman soldiers arriving in your village for the blood tax. They'd take the strongest, healthiest, most promising boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 14, and march them off to Istanbul. Forever. These boys were converted to Islam, renamed, and trained to become soldiers, scribes, or administrators. Some were placed in the Janissary Corps, an elite military force. Others entered the palace system, rising to high ranks if they were clever, obedient, and loyal. It sounds like upward mobility. But remember, these boys were ripped from their families, stripped of identity, forbidden from returning home, and used as tools of empire. Some rose to greatness, but many were broken in the process. Back in the villages, parents wept and prayed. Some tried to hide their sons. Others bribed local officials. But the Devshirme was relentless, systematic human trafficking in the name of empire. Now let's look at education, or the lack of it. For most Ottoman subjects, education was a luxury. If you were male and Muslim, you might learn to read and write at a mekteb, a small neighborhood school attached to a mosque. But the curriculum was narrow, memorizing the Quran, basic arithmetic, some poetry. For girls, education was almost non-existent unless you belonged to the elite. If you were Christian or Jewish, your education came from your own community and was often secretive, especially during more repressive periods. The empire feared independent thought. Scholars who questioned official doctrine were labeled heretics. Books were tightly controlled. Printing in Arabic script was banned for centuries. The first Muslim-run printing press wasn't allowed until 1727, over 250 years after Gutenberg. Why? Because books meant ideas, and ideas meant rebellion. Now imagine being a woman in the Ottoman world. Women lived under a tight grip of social control, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish. Most were married off young, often by age 12 or 13. Marriages were arranged, dowries negotiated, and love rarely entered the picture. Your world was the home, confined to domestic space, veiled in public, restricted from travel, and expected to produce sons. If you couldn't, you might be cast aside. Some women found power within the household. Mothers, especially of sons, could gain respect. A few broke through the system entirely, like the famous Hurrem Sultan, who rose from slave concubine to political queen. But these were extreme exceptions, myths that obscure the daily reality of obedience, invisibility, and dependency. And let's not forget the women of the imperial harem. Contrary to fantasy, the harem wasn't a den of hedonistic pleasure. It was a rigidly hierarchical, competitive, and often terrifying institution. Women were brought in as slaves, some captured in war, others bought from Circassian or Georgian markets. They were trained in etiquette, Islam, music, dance, and constant political maneuvering. Only a few ever caught the Sultan's eye. Few were stillborn children. Many died anonymous, imprisoned their entire lives within palace walls, speaking in whispers, watching their backs. The harem was not freedom, it was velvet cushion captivity. Meanwhile, for those outside the palace, life was brutal in different ways. Plague swept the empire repeatedly. Entire quarters of Istanbul were decimated. The poor were buried in mass graves. Cities stank with death, and people prayed to survive the next breath. Medical care? Primitive at best. Superstition ran rampant. Cures included leeches, exorcisms, and prayers. Surgery was often performed without anesthetic. Mental illness? Consider possession. The mentally ill were sometimes kept in hospitals where they were chained, beaten, or starved. And then there was food or lack thereof. Famine hit regularly. Harvests failed due to drought, war, or pestilence. The empire's vast network of taxation funneled food upward, leaving villages stripped bare. Peasants were expected to tithe to landowners, religious officials, and state collectors, all before feeding their own families. If you couldn't pay, your land might be seized. Your children might be taken as labor. Or worse, you'd be publicly beaten or imprisoned. And yet, there was no rebellion without consequences. Ottoman rulers crushed uprisings with terrifying speed. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were razed. Whole provinces depopulated. Rebels impaled, flayed, or executed en masse. But sometimes, rebellion still came. In Part 2, we'll dive deeper into military life, slavery, taxation systems, and the constant fear of betrayal that ran through Ottoman society like a poison thread. Because while the empire offered power to a few, it devoured the many. In the Ottoman world, the more you rose, the more dangerous the fall. And for most, you never even got off the ground. In the vast, creaking machinery of the Ottoman Empire, one will turn more ruthlessly than almost any other, the wheel of war. The empire's armies were legendary: the janissaries, the cavalry, the sappers who undermined enemy walls. Ottoman expansion terrified Europe for centuries. But being part of that war machine wasn't glorious. For most, it was miserable, violent, and very often, terminal. Let's begin with the janissaries, the elite force often romanticized in history books. At first glance, the janissaries appear powerful. Clad in distinctive uniforms with curved swords and strict discipline, they were the Sultan's personal army. They answered only to him, lived by a rigid code, and could rise to high status. But the foundation of their core was trauma. These soldiers weren't born Ottoman. They were boys, as we explored in Part 1, taken from their Christian families under the Devshirme system, converted, renamed, and trained in isolation. Their emotions were stripped away. They were not allowed to marry or own property. They lived in barracks, under constant surveillance. Brotherhood was enforced, but so was obedience. And the brutality didn't end with training. Janissaries were thrown into the worst battles, used as shock troops to break fortifications, storm cities, and slaughter enemies. They often died young, surrounded by fire, steel, and cannon smoke. Later, when janissaries gained power and began influencing politics, the Sultanate cracked down violently. Janissary rebellions were crushed with mass executions, entire regiments drowned in the Bosphorus, burned in their barracks, or publicly beheaded. It was a grim trade, loyalty for survival, until that loyalty was no longer useful. But outside the Janissary ranks, things weren't better. Regular conscripts from rural villages were treated as cannon fodder, poorly armed, poorly trained, and often sent into battle hungry and ill. Medical care was non-existent. Wounds meant infection. Recovery meant crippling disability. If you didn't die from a sword, you might die from gangrene. And if you deserted? Execution, torture, or being hunted down by your own people. Now consider the logistical nightmare behind the army. The forced laborers, cooks, tent bearers, water carriers, mule drivers. These people weren't even soldiers. They were beasts of burden. They marched for months across deserts and mountains, often barefoot, collapsing from exhaustion, disease, or starvation. They were paid little or nothing, and had no say in where they went or what they did. And then there were the conquered. When the Ottomans took a city, say Belgrade, Cairo, or Baghdad, the consequences for civilians could be catastrophic. Looting, burning, and rape were common. Resistance was met with impalement, beheading, or being sold into slavery. Because yes, slavery was a vital part of the Ottoman economy. While Europe was still buying and selling Africans through the Atlantic trade, the Ottomans operated vast internal networks of human bondage. Slaves were taken from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. They worked as household servants, laborers, concubines, soldiers, and even bureaucrats. Some, like the palace eunuchs or elite administrators, had influence. but they were still slaves. They could be executed at the whim of their masters. Their families were often never seen again. And for most slaves, life was hard labor, for food, no rights, and constant danger. In the cities, slave markets buzzed daily. Children were auctioned. Women were appraised like livestock. Men were examined for muscle tone. Prices fluctuated with the seasons. And nobody, not even the religious authorities, thought this was wrong. It was normalized, even sacred, because the law allowed it. Meanwhile, back in the empire's sprawling countryside, a different sort of suffering festered: taxation. Ottoman tax collection was a labyrinth of corruption. On paper, it looked efficient. There were timar holders, local nobles who received land in exchange for military service, and they were supposed to collect revenue responsibly. In reality, it was a feeding frenzy. Tax collectors often demanded more than required. They'd squeeze peasants dry, confiscate tools, take livestock, even threaten to enslave children. There were taxes on land, on crops, on livestock, on marriage, on inheritance, on trade, on everything. Even traveling from one village to another required paying tolls. Want to use a bridge? Pay up. Want to carry grain to market? That's another cut. Didn't pay on time? The punishment could be a flogging or losing your farm. If you were Christian or Jewish, you paid the additional jizya, a special head tax simply for being non-Muslim. It reminded you, every year, that you were a tolerated outsider. Now imagine trying to plan your life under such a regime. A single bad harvest could ruin you. A corrupt tax collector could destroy your family. There was no bank, no safety net, no state aid. The empire's wealth flowed upward, to Istanbul, to the palace, to the pashas and viziers. You survived off crumbs. And when the treasury ran dry, the empire turned inward, stripping its own people even harder. This pressure often led to rebellions. Across Anatolia and the Balkans, peasant revolts broke out. But these uprisings were met with overwhelming force: villages burned, men hanged, women enslaved. The empire couldn't tolerate instability. Speaking of instability, let's discuss the court itself, where life at the top was just as dangerous as life at the bottom. The Ottoman royal court was a swirling vortex of intrigue, backstabbing, and paranoia. Sultans ruled absolutely, but they were constantly surrounded by scheming advisors, ambitious viziers, and jealous brothers. Succession wasn't clear-cut. In fact, for centuries, it was brutally simple: kill your brothers before they kill you. This was fratricide by law. When a sultan's son inherited the throne, it was expected, often required, that he execute his brothers to prevent civil war. These executions weren't subtle. Strangulation with silk cords was common, bloodless, but still horrific. Entire families were wiped out in a single night. Mothers wept silently. Eunuchs did the dirty work, and no one dared complain. Power was everything. Blood was the price. Even the sultan's own sons weren't safe. If they appeared too ambitious or too popular, they might be executed preemptively. Some princes were sent to remote provinces as governors, isolated, watched, and sometimes poisoned. And their mothers? The Valide Sultan, the queen mother, might pull strings for them, but she also had rivals. The imperial harem was a battlefield. Women poisoned each other. Slaves betrayed their mistresses. Even whispers could destroy lives. Now let's pull back and look at the broader society. The Ottoman Empire prided itself on being multi-ethnic and multilingual, but this diversity was often a source of tension, not harmony. Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, Slavs, Jews, and Turks all lived under one rule, but not equally. Each group had its own religious leaders, legal systems, and cultural practices, but they were always subordinate to imperial authority. A Greek merchant might be rich, but he could be ruined by a Muslim rival's accusation. An Armenian priest might guide his community, but he couldn't speak against the Sultan. A Kurdish clan might control a valley, but one wrong move could bring the army. Ethnic tension simmered constantly. Pogroms, riots, and scapegoating occurred, especially when times were hard. And they were often hard. Even the cities, Istanbul, Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, were fragile ecosystems. A bad winter? People starved. A fire? Entire districts burned. An outbreak of plague? Tens of thousands might die in a few weeks. Hospitals were rare. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Water sources were contaminated. Rats thrived. And yet the government continued to build palaces while ignoring infrastructure. For the vast majority of Ottoman subjects, daily life was a struggle. Struggle to eat. Struggle to stay clean. Struggle to survive taxes. Struggle to avoid disease. Struggle to not offend the wrong person. Struggle to simply exist. But don't be fooled into thinking it was all passive misery. People resisted. They prayed. They schemed. They clung to music, poetry, stories, and family. And sometimes they revolted. Sometimes they fought back. Imagine you've somehow survived childhood under the Ottoman yoke. You're a peasant, a tradesman, maybe even a minor functionary in a dusty provincial town. You think you've escaped the worst of it. But now comes the part of life that really grinds you down. Military conscription, endless taxes, routine corruption, and the omnipresent fear of betrayal. Let's start with the Ottoman military system, once feared across continents, but for ordinary people, a nightmare. If you were Muslim, male, and healthy, you were expected to serve. For rural villagers, the empire's constant appetite for manpower meant being yanked from your family and farm with little notice. You might be thrown into the Timar system, a semi-feudal arrangement where military service was tied to landholding, or simply conscripted into infantry forces with barely enough training to hold a musket. Conditions were appalling. Soldiers were often poorly fed, underpaid, and forced to march thousands of miles with little rest. During the empire's long wars in Europe and Persia, death rates from cold, starvation, and disease sometimes outpaced combat deaths. Desertion was common, but punishable by death. And the Janissaries? Those elite soldiers once drawn from the Devshirme system? They were feared enforcers of the Sultan's will, but not immune to the brutality. As palace politics became more unstable in later centuries, Janissaries found themselves caught between factions, used as political pawns, or purged en masse when their loyalty was questioned. The longer the empire aged, the more the Janissaries became a bloated, corrupt shadow of their former glory, turning their weapons inward, shaking down townspeople, starting riots, even assassinating sultans. The line between soldier and street thug blurred dangerously. For those not conscripted into military life, your struggle came in a different form: taxes. And oh, were there taxes? Ottoman taxation was a labyrinth of fees, duties, tolls, and levies, all extracted with little mercy. Peasants owed grain, livestock, olive oil, wool, and labor. Merchants faced tariffs on goods at every checkpoint, city gate, and harbor. Fishermen paid a share of their catch. Shepherds paid for each head of animal. Even bakers and weavers faced taxes based on guesswork. There was a special levy for weddings, another for funerals. You paid when you bought a donkey. You paid again when you crossed a bridge. If a local official decided your house looked too nice for your station, new tax. And these weren't just state taxes. Local notables, corrupt officials, and middlemen all took a slice, demanding bribes or gifts to keep things moving. The actual law might say one thing, but enforcement was inconsistent and often based on personal power. Some people tried to flee into forests or mountains to escape the tax burden. Others turned to petty crime. Some revolted, but those revolts usually ended in burning villages and mass executions. Corruption wasn't a bug in the Ottoman system. It was the oil that kept the machine running. Many provincial governors, or beys, operated as little kings. They ruled their territories like private fiefdoms, collecting more than the law required, punishing those who couldn't pay, rewarding loyal enforcers, and sending just enough upward to keep Istanbul happy. In fact, the Ottoman system relied on a principle called tax farming iltizam, where powerful individuals bought the right to collect taxes in a given region. Once they paid the state, everything else they could squeeze out of the locals was theirs to keep. This incentivized brutal overcollection. And the peasants? They couldn't read, they didn't understand imperial law, and they had no legal protection. Complaining only made you a target. Now let's talk about betrayal, not the romantic kind, but the kind that destroyed lives overnight. Ottoman society was built on spying, silence, and fear. The Sultan needed to know everything. Who was loyal, who was conspiring, who was whispering the wrong thing in the marketplace. So he used an elaborate system of informants, secret police, and eavesdroppers. In cities like Istanbul and Cairo, it was well known that every coffee house and mosque had at least one ear for the palace. Even a casual joke about the Sultan's beard or the Grand Vizier's wife could be reported, and once you were accused, you had no chance to defend yourself. You could be dragged from your home at night, interrogated, imprisoned without trial, or simply disappear. Entire families could fall from favor because of a single wrong word. And the punishments? They were designed to send a message. Impaling, beheading, drowning, strangulation with silk cords, noble, execution, or crucifixion, all were used depending on the crime and status of the accused. Sometimes heads were mounted on stakes at city gates. Other times, people were left to rot in public squares. It wasn't just individuals who were punished. Communities could be collectively held accountable. If a village failed to report a tax collector's murder, the whole region might face military reprisal. But it wasn't just fear from above. Betrayal came from neighbors too. People denounced each other out of jealousy, spite, or survival. That woman who looked at your husband too long? Maybe she's a witch. That merchant who's prospering while others suffer? Maybe he's cheating or hoarding grain. The Jewish tailor with connections in Istanbul? Maybe he's a spy. Accusation became a tool. In Ottoman life, truth was fragile, and silence was safety. Meanwhile, your odds of escape or advancement were next to none. Mobility in the empire depended on religion, gender, and connections. If you were Muslim, male, and literate, you might enter the ulama, the scholarly religious elite. But even then, advancement required patronage. One wrong political alignment and you'd be demoted, exiled, or worse. For non-Muslims, things were worse. You couldn't join the army. You couldn't rise in the bureaucracy. You were restricted in trade. You were barred from certain professions. And your word in court carried less weight than that of a Muslim's. There were occasional exceptions: wealthy Armenians who served as imperial financiers, Jewish doctors in the palace, but they lived on a knife's edge. At the whim of the court, even the highest non-Muslim official could be stripped of his fortune, imprisoned, or executed. One bad rumor, one jealous rival, one shift in court politics. You were done. Now let's examine urban life, not just in the slums, but also among the tradesmen, artisans, and working poor in cities like Aleppo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sarajevo. These cities pulsed with markets, mosques, and madrasas, but also with crushing poverty. Craft guilds, esnaf, controlled most trades. At first glance, this gave workers structure, an apprentice system, price regulation, mutual support. But in reality, guilds were rigid, exclusive, and easily corrupted. If you didn't have family in the guild or couldn't afford the bribes, you were out. If you broke guild rules or competed with established masters, you could be beaten, blacklisted, or worse. Merchants faced constant obstacles. Caravan routes were vulnerable to bandits, tolls, and corrupt customs agents. If you transported goods across provincial borders, you were often stopped at dozens of checkpoints, each one demanding payment or paperwork. And prices were tightly controlled. Go too high, and you could be accused of hoarding or exploiting the faithful. Women in urban centers had even less agency. While some wealthy Muslim women owned property or managed businesses behind the scenes, the vast majority were invisible, kept indoors, veiled in public, unable to leave home without permission or male escort. Widows, divorcees, or women without male protectors often ended up in desperate poverty, turning to low-paid domestic work or worse, forced prostitution, which was technically illegal but quietly tolerated in certain quarters. Even basic public services were failing. Streets were unpaved, water systems broke down, trash accumulated. Fire swept through neighborhoods regularly, destroying hundreds of homes. Earthquakes left entire cities in ruins, and rebuilding could take decades. Disease ran rampant. Plague, cholera, dysentery, typhus. Cities were breeding grounds for death. Quarantine existed in theory, but enforcement was spotty. Superstition often overrode science. Prayers and charms were seen as better than medicine. Hospitals were few and underfunded. And if you were poor, you just suffered at home until you died, unrecorded and unmourned by the state. And yet, the people endured. They turned to poetry, religion, music. They formed secret brotherhoods, whispered songs of rebellion, passed folk tales of justice and vengeance. They prayed for better rulers, dreamed of golden ages, and shared whatever scraps they had with neighbors. In Part 4, we'll explore how life slowly crumbled during the empire's long decline. When rot spread from the center, the economy fractured, and violence erupted not just from rulers, but from neighbors and rivals. We'll also examine how the system began to collapse under its own weight, leaving ordinary people to pick through the ruins. Because as bad as things were during the Ottoman peak, for many, the centuries of slow collapse were even worse. And the echoes of that collapse still shape lives today. By the 18th century, the once mighty Ottoman Empire was already limping into decline, and for ordinary people, that meant life didn't just suck, it collapsed. Taxes rose higher, trade broke down, banditry soared, and the delicate balance between rulers and ruled snapped. Let's begin with the economy. The Ottoman economy had long relied on control of vital trade routes between East and West. But with the rise of European maritime powers like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and Britain, those land routes became obsolete. Shipping was faster, cheaper, and far less dangerous than crossing Ottoman roads infested with tolls, thieves, and bureaucrats. Caravans grew fewer. Markets thinned. Artisan guilds weakened. Inflation surged, driven in part by the flood of silver from the New World. Prices rose, but wages did not. And for most, there was no escape. Many Ottoman subjects turned to debt just to survive. Local moneylenders, often powerful families or religious foundations, offered loans at high interest, demanding collateral like land, livestock, or even labor from future generations. A failed harvest could mean losing your house, your tools, your freedom. Meanwhile, Ottoman coinage was debased. Copper coins replaced silver ones. Trust in the currency collapsed. Barter returned. Peasants began hiding grain or selling directly to smugglers and foreign traders just to avoid the corrupt state apparatus. Then came the bandits. As central power weakened, many former soldiers, outlaws, and even impoverished villagers took up arms. They became Salali rebels in Anatolia, Hayduks in the Balkans, or nameless highwaymen across the empire. These groups weren't always political. They were hungry, angry, and desperate. They raided caravans, looted villages, kidnapped nobles for ransom. And in some cases, these bandits were indistinguishable from the local militias and governors meant to stop them. Armed men ruled by terror, and ordinary civilians were simply in the way. The Ottomans tried to suppress the chaos with force, but the army was a mess. The Janissaries had become an entrenched elite, more interested in palace politics and urban extortion than actual military defense. They ran coffee houses, taxed markets, and sold protection to wealthy citizens. In some cities, they functioned as a mafia, not a defense force. Attempts to modernize the military, introducing Western-style uniforms, weapons, and drills, sparked rebellions. The old guard resisted change. Reformist sultans like Selim III and Mahmud II were threatened, deposed, or assassinated by their own troops. And through it all, the countryside burned. Entire regions of Anatolia became ungovernable. Provinces in the Balkans and the Arab world slipped from control. Nomadic tribes refused taxation. Kurdish warlords ruled the east. Arab sheiks defied the central state. Even some Christian leaders, granted limited autonomy under the millet system, began asserting more independence. With no functioning central authority, villages turned inward. They built walls. They made alliances. They armed children. They bribed bandits for peace. Life shrank into a game of survival. And within the cities, the rot only deepened. Urban decay was visible in every corner of the empire. Roads fell apart. Bridges collapsed. Aqueducts dried up. Entire neighborhoods turned to slums, unlit, unpaved, unsafe. The sick begged in the streets. The dead were buried in mass graves. Religious institutions once central to Ottoman life also began to fragment. Mosques remained, but funding dried up. Waqf foundations, endowments that paid for schools, hospitals, and public works, were looted, mismanaged, or politicized. Education became a tool of religious orthodoxy rather than practical learning. Science stagnated. Superstition surged. And social divisions became explosive. The line between Muslim and non-Muslim, Sunni and Shiite, Turk and Arab, became sharper. In places like the Balkans and eastern Anatolia, sectarian violence flared. Christian communities were accused of collaborating with foreign powers. Jewish neighborhoods were blamed for economic collapses. Armenians were scapegoated for political unrest. These weren't just words. They led to pogroms, massacres, burnings, and displacements. By the 19th century, the seeds of ethnic hatred had taken deep root, seeds that would later bloom into genocides and nationalist revolts. And the Ottomans, desperate to keep control, tightened the screws. They deployed secret police. They empowered brutal governors. They used mass executions to silence unrest. They taxed to the bone. They extracted the last ounce of labor and loyalty from a bleeding population. Meanwhile, in the imperial court, the palace swirled with intrigue, decadence, and delusion. The sultans, once warrior rulers like Mehmed the Conqueror or Suleiman the Magnificent, were now often weak, isolated, and manipulated by factions. Some were mentally ill. Others were little more than ceremonial figures, trapped in the sprawling Topkapi palace, shielded from reality. Behind the scenes, the true power was wielded by viziers, eunuchs, and even members of the harem. Corruption ran from the bottom to the very top. Sultans were overthrown by palace coups. Brothers were strangled to prevent succession crises. Reformers were murdered by reactionaries. Conservatism triumphed over modernization time and again. And every failed reform meant more suffering for the people. Even those reform movements that tried to Europeanize the empire in the 19th century, like the Tanzimat, had mixed effects. Yes, they introduced railroads, new schools, and a modern legal code. But they also increased taxation, favored urban elites, and disrupted centuries-old local systems. Many peasants viewed these reforms not as progress, but as alien, foreign, and oppressive. And for many Muslim citizens, the reforms seemed to empower Christians and Jews at their expense. Tension sharpened. The dream of an Ottoman identity that transcended religion began to die. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, things went from bad to catastrophic. Famine stalked Anatolia. Revolts erupted across the Arab world. The Balkans broke away. Egypt was lost. Libya fell. The empire teetered on the edge of collapse, and yet the state demanded more. More loyalty. More taxes. More sacrifice. World War I would be the final nail. The Ottoman Empire entered on the side of Germany, ill-prepared, disorganized, and broken. Millions died. The Armenian genocide killed over 1 million. Greeks and Assyrians were slaughtered or driven out. Entire cities were destroyed. The Arab Revolt shattered Ottoman control across the Levant. British and French forces carved up the Middle East. And when the war ended, so did the empire. The Ottoman state ceased to exist in 1922, leaving behind a shattered landscape of refugee camps, orphaned children, collapsed cities, and traumatized survivors. But what was it like to live through that end? For the average Ottoman subject, it meant utter confusion. Maps were redrawn. Borders shifted. Flags changed. Families were uprooted. Ethnic cleansing was widespread. In the new nation-states that rose in the empire's ashes, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, the Balkans carried the trauma forward. The old imperial structure may have vanished, but its ghost lingered. The culture of fear, surveillance, and suspicion didn't die. It transformed. New governments borrowed the same tactics: secret police, centralized authority, propaganda, scapegoating minorities. The economic exploitation didn't vanish either. Many former Ottoman elites simply changed allegiance, becoming landlords and politicians in the new regimes. The peasants remained poor. The cities remained overcrowded. The scars remained raw. And perhaps worst of all, the memory of life under the Ottomans was often romanticized by those in power. Instead of confronting the brutality, some painted the empire as a glorious golden age, full of wisdom, tolerance, and order. The dirt, disease, and death? Forgotten. The impalings, pogroms, and executions? Airbrushed from textbooks. But the truth is still there, written in forgotten letters, ruins of burned villages, oral histories passed from grandmothers to grandchildren. For most who lived under the Ottomans, life wasn't a tale of glory. It was hunger, fear, silence, obedience. It was watching your son taken for war, your daughter taken for marriage, your village taken for taxes. It was bracing for the knock on the door at midnight. It was praying to be left alone. And while the empire produced great poetry, art, architecture, and governance, it did so on the backs of millions who suffered in silence. Today, as you walk through Istanbul's domed mosques, Sarajevo's stone bridges, or Aleppo's battered streets, you're walking through the bones of that history. A history of empire, yes, but also of resistance, resilience, and raw human survival. And maybe now, when you hear about sultans and viziers, harems and janissaries, you'll remember the other side. The mud, the blood, and the silence. The real Ottoman Empire, the one that sucked. Let's start by tearing down the myth. Ancient Egypt, golden sun, endless fields of grain, and rivers overflowing with fish, right? Not quite. The truth is, food in ancient Egypt sucked. Not in the sense that there wasn't any, there was. But it was repetitive, dangerous, difficult to get, and often downright disgusting. For the vast majority of people, not the pharaohs or high priests, but the farmers, laborers, and slaves, eating was a daily struggle between hunger, parasites, and spoiled ingredients. So, what did they actually eat? The backbone of the Egyptian diet was bread. It sounds simple, but this wasn't the soft, warm, crusty kind of bread you're imagining. Egyptian bread was dense, gritty, hard as stone, and sometimes literally full of stone. Bread was made from emmer wheat and barley, ground using a saddle quern, essentially a slab of stone and another stone you rub over it by hand. Every single loaf contained microscopic fragments of the grinding stone. Over time, this grit wore down teeth like sandpaper. Even young adult skeletons from ancient Egypt show extreme dental wear, teeth ground down to stubs, abscesses, exposed nerves, and infections that could spread to the bloodstream. And that was the staple food. You might say, well, at least they had beer. They did, but ancient Egyptian beer wasn't the cold, refreshing drink you might imagine. It was thick, porridge-like, often made from fermented bread mashed in water. It was cloudy, chunky, and only mildly alcoholic. Everyone drank it, men, women, and even children, because the water wasn't safe. But the beer wasn't exactly clean, either. It was a warm, sludgy brew that spoiled fast in the Egyptian heat. And like the bread, it was full of debris. We're talking husks, grit, stray insects, and occasionally mold. Egyptian beer was made in large batches, usually by women in households or temple kitchens, and it wasn't filtered or standardized. If you were lucky, it gave you a buzz. If you weren't, it gave you food poisoning. Now let's talk meat. If you were poor, and most people were, you almost never ate it. Cattle, sheep, and goats were expensive. They were more valuable alive, producing milk, wool, or labor. When animals were slaughtered, it was usually for religious festivals or funerals, and the best cuts went to the temples or elite households. Ordinary Egyptians might get a few scraps, tripe, liver, or a chunk of lung. Occasionally, they'd catch birds or fish from the Nile. But even that came with a catch. Fish were abundant, sure, but without refrigeration or proper preservation, they spoiled quickly. Salt was scarce and valuable. Smoking was a technique that required fuel, wood, also rare in Egypt. So most fish were eaten quickly, often half-cooked or sun-dried in the open air. This attracted flies. Flies laid eggs, and eggs became larvae. Eating fish often meant eating maggots. It also meant running the risk of intestinal parasites, like flatworms, tapeworms, and roundworms that thrived in the warm, wet, unclean environment. Shellfish? Forbidden for many. Pigs? Considered unclean in most periods. And if you were a slave or laborer, you were likely eating the same mush every day. Beer and bread, over and over again. Vegetables? You'd think Egypt's fertile fields would be full of them, but the selection was limited. They had onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, and lentils. These grew in the Nile's floodplains, and they were the backbone of most meals. But again, washing was minimal, cooking methods were crude, and contamination was constant. Onions and garlic were prized, but also stank up the breath of the population. Ancient writers from Greece, including Herodotus, commented on the overwhelming stench of Egyptian laborers. Imagine tens of thousands of men working on a tomb or temple, sweating in the sun, reeking of garlic and beer. It wasn't romantic. It was nauseating. Then there was the issue of storage. Egypt was hot, scorching hot. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Granaries kept wheat and barley, but they were often infested with rats, mice, beetles, and weevils. Archaeological digs have found mummified rodents sealed in storage jars. These weren't isolated incidents. Every granary had pests. Every kitchen had flies. Every loaf of bread was a gamble. Fruit was seasonal and limited. Dates, figs, and sycamore fruit were available, but not year-round. When stored, they attracted mold. When dried, they were often overrun with bugs. Honey was used to preserve some fruits, but it was expensive and rare outside of temples. And sugar? Forget it. Sugarcane wasn't cultivated until much later. Most people in Egypt never tasted anything sweet in their lives unless it came from fruit or honey, both occasional luxuries. Even water, the one thing you'd expect to be plentiful, was risky. The Nile was sacred, but it was also polluted. Waste from people and animals flowed directly into it. Crocodiles, snakes, and parasites made swimming dangerous. Wells existed, but they were deep and hard to dig. In many villages, water came from open canals or jars exposed to heat and contamination. People drank beer because water was unsafe. But the beer wasn't healthy either. So infections spread. Diarrhea was common. Dehydration followed. Children were especially vulnerable, and many didn't survive past age 5. Now consider what happened during a bad Nile year. The Nile flooded annually, and that flood determined everything. Too much water, and the fields were washed away. Too little, and the crops failed. If the flood was weak, famine followed. Entire villages starved. Granaries ran dry. People sold their children into slavery just to survive. The government tried to help sometimes, There were records of state grain distributions, rationing, and emergency aid. But the truth is, Egypt's food supply was fragile. One bad harvest could mean mass death. Even in good years, the labor to produce food was brutal. Men plowed the fields by hand or with oxen. Women ground grain for hours every day. Children helped carry water, chase pests, and collect dung for fertilizer. And what about disease? Well, the grit in bread destroyed teeth. The beer introduced bacteria. The raw vegetables carried parasites. And the lack of proper sewage meant every village was a ticking time bomb of infections. Archaeological studies of mummies show widespread malnutrition, anemia, and chronic illness. Many people had worm infestations. Their bellies swelled while their limbs shrank. Skeletons show signs of vitamin deficiencies, especially rickets and scurvy. Even those who could eat their fill weren't safe. The elite had better food, more meat, and imported delicacies, but they also had gout, heart disease, and obesity. Their diets were unbalanced, heavy in fats and starches. And unlike their laborers, they didn't move much. A life of indulgence led to an early death just as surely as a life of starvation. So, let's summarize. Bread broke your teeth. Beer gave you diarrhea. Vegetables carried worms. Meat was rare. Fish were full of parasites. Water was filthy. And during a drought, your whole family could die. Doesn't sound like a paradise, does it? Sure. Ancient Egypt had impressive monuments, powerful gods, and a long-lasting civilization, but behind the temples and pyramids was a daily diet of monotony, misery, and malnutrition. And we've only just begun. Food in ancient Egypt wasn't just nourishment. It was identity, power, and punishment. What you ate, or didn't eat, defined your place in the social pyramid. And that pyramid, just like the real ones, was steep, narrow at the top, and crushingly heavy at the bottom. Let's start with the rich. Pharaohs, nobles, and high priests had access to things most Egyptians never saw. They ate beef, duck, goose, and fish caught from personal estates along the Nile. They had wine, not just beer. They imported exotic goods, honey, spices, and dried fruits from the Levant and Nubia. Their bread was sometimes sweetened with dates or infused with herbs. Their food was cooked in bronze or ceramic pots, not hastily prepared in open fire pits like the peasants' meals. But even in elite households, food was about more than taste. It was about display. Feasts were political tools. Elaborate banquets were staged to show off status, wealth, and divine favor. Food was piled high, much of it uneaten, just to show that you could waste it. And these feasts were closed affairs. No laborers, no farmers, not even low-ranking priests. Just the elite, separated by miles of etiquette and walls of stone. Yet despite this abundance, the rich didn't necessarily eat well. They were frequently ill. CT scans and studies of elite mummies have shown high rates of obesity, heart disease, and dental abscesses. The sugar in dried fruit and honey rotted their teeth. The high-fat diet led to arterial plaque. Many elites died relatively young, bloated, and sick from their own excess. Meanwhile, the poor ate to survive and sometimes didn't even manage that. Let's talk about religious food rules. The gods were everywhere in Egypt, and food was always part of worship. But here's the catch. What the gods were offered, and what the people ate, were vastly different things. Temples received offerings of cattle, bread, beer, fruits, vegetables, incense, and wine, sometimes several times a day. But these weren't sacrifices burned on altars. Most of the food was redistributed, sometimes to priests, sometimes to government officials, and only rarely to the people who needed it most. Priests lived largely off temple offerings. They were required to bathe several times a day, wear linen, shave their bodies, and follow specific dietary laws depending on the deity they served. Some couldn't eat fish. Others avoided pork. A few consumed nothing that had been tainted by foreign soil. The result? Priests, despite being a religious class, often ate better than the farmers who grew the food in the first place. Now, let's look at funerary food. This is where things get truly surreal. Tombs were packed with food, preserved meats, dried bread, fruits, jars of wine, and whole-cooked birds, sometimes mummified. These weren't always real food items. Wealthy Egyptians commissioned models of food, miniature clay loaves, and painted meats meant to magically provide sustenance in the afterlife. But this obsession with feeding the dead meant the living sometimes went hungry. Tomb workers and embalmers were paid in food, but not much. Priests who maintained funerary cults consumed regular offerings, even centuries after a person had died. Families sometimes went into debt maintaining tomb rituals to avoid starving their deceased ancestors, while their own children starved at home. And when times were hard, things turned ugly. During famines, tombs were raided, not for gold, but for food. Archaeological records show broken jars, disturbed offerings, and even the cooking of funerary meats meant for the dead. Desperation blurred the line between reverence and survival. Then there's the matter of food fraud. You'd think ancient food would be basic and honest. But even in 2000 BCE, people cut corners. Olive oil was diluted with cheaper fats. Beer was watered down or soured. Bread was bulked up with sand or clay to save on grain. Fish was sold slightly off and masked with herbs. Spoiled meat was recooked and passed off as fresh. Vendors cheated weights. Bakers reused flour from moldy stock. Grain sellers hid weevils under sacks. It was a world with no consumer protection, no labels, and no legal recourse. If you got sick, that was your problem. And if you tried to complain, tough luck. The local official might be in on it. Many food vendors paid bribes or shared profits with bureaucrats to avoid punishment. Now let's talk taxes and how they made everything worse. In ancient Egypt, taxation was paid in kind. That means no coins. You paid with grain, beer, livestock, or labor. If you were a farmer, a huge chunk of your harvest, sometimes up to 2/3, went straight to the state or temple. This wasn't optional. Scribes kept meticulous records. Officials visited villages and granaries. If you couldn't pay, they seized goods, livestock, or even your children. Families were broken up. Men were conscripted to work on royal projects. Women were sometimes forced into temple service or domestic labor. During low Nile years, these tax demands didn't disappear. They increased because the state needed to secure its own food supply first. That meant peasants bore the full burden of famine, even as officials dined on temple reserves. And let's not forget forced laborers. Tens of thousands of men were drafted every year to build temples, monuments, and tombs. They weren't slaves in the modern sense, but they weren't free either. Most were seasonal workers, paid in rations, beer, bread, onions, and occasionally fish. Sounds fair? Not really. These rations were minimal and sometimes didn't arrive on time. Workers went on strike. The world's first documented labor strike happened under Pharaoh Ramses III, when tomb builders refused to work until they were fed. Their complaints are written on papyri. "We are hungry," they said. "We have no fish. We have no vegetables." This was in a royal necropolis, working on the king's eternal home. If the king's own builders were starving, imagine how the rest of the country fared. Children weren't spared either. Malnutrition began young. Skeletal remains of children show stunted growth, bowed legs from rickets, and underdeveloped teeth. Many died before the age of 5 from dysentery, dehydration, or worm infestations. Milk was available, but not clean. Women breastfed until age 3 or 4, which delayed subsequent pregnancies, a form of population control. But when babies were weaned, they often drank diluted beer or contaminated water. Diarrhea killed more infants than any war ever did. Let's look at another angle: food distribution. Egypt's geography made food transport difficult. The Nile was the main highway, but only for those who owned boats. Most villages relied on ox carts, donkeys, or foot travel. That meant delays, spoilage, and often total isolation during floods. When granaries in Thebes overflowed, people in rural Fayum might still starve. When the pharaoh feasted in Memphis, Nubian laborers chewed dry lentils in the dust. There was no national safety net, no emergency transport, no equitable distribution. And yet, despite all this hardship, food was used in rituals with eerie precision. In love spells, women baked bread mixed with bodily fluids to win a man's heart. In curses, priests inscribed names on loaves and smashed them as symbolic destruction. In offerings, food was laid out for gods who never ate, while the priests quickly claimed the leftovers. The dead were fed with ritual meals, then those meals were eaten by the mortuary cult. Nothing went to waste, but little reached the hungry. So here's the brutal truth. Food in ancient Egypt wasn't just bad. It was used as a weapon, a tool of control, a system of inequality embedded in every loaf, every jug, every spoonful of mush handed to a starving child. And the irony? This was the civilization that invented menus, that painted detailed food scenes on tomb walls, that preserved food for eternity, that worshipped gods of grain, beer, and fertility. They revered food, but denied it to so many. You can tell a lot about a civilization by what killed its people. And in ancient Egypt, Food was often both the cause and the carrier of death. Let's start with the basics. Grain, the cornerstone of Egyptian survival. Most people lived off bread and beer, both made from immer wheat and barley. But these grains weren't clean. Fields flooded during the Nile's annual inundation, leaving behind rich silt, and also contaminants. Animal waste, dead fish, decaying plant matter, everything washed in and settled into the soil. Harvested grain was stored in massive silos, but these weren't sealed or sanitary. Rodents gnawed into them. Insects laid eggs. Mold thrived in the heat. Once fungus got a foothold, it released mycotoxins, invisible poisons that could cause vomiting, hallucinations, liver failure, and death. And yet, the people kept baking. The bread itself was rough. Ground on stone querns, the flour was full of grit, sand, and mineral flakes from the grinding surfaces. Microscopic studies of ancient Egyptian teeth show enamel worn down to the dentin by age 20. Jaw abscesses, infections, and even tooth loss were common. Imagine chewing sandpaper 3 times a day for your whole life. That's what eating was like. Then there was beer, not the kind you imagine. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and chunky, more a porridge than a drink. It was fermented with wild yeast, stored in open jars, and served lukewarm. It spoiled quickly. Flies hovered around the rim. Fermentation was unpredictable, and alcohol levels varied widely. Sometimes, it made people pleasantly drunk. Other times, it gave them diarrhea for days. But spoiled food wasn't the only problem. It was what lived in it. Let's talk parasites. The Nile was sacred, but it was also filthy. People bathed in it, drank from it, washed clothes in it, fished from it, dumped waste in it, and even performed rituals in it. It teemed with microscopic life, and much of it was deadly. The most infamous culprit? Schistosomiasis, also called bilharzia. This parasite, carried by freshwater snails, entered the body through the skin. All it took was walking through an irrigation ditch. Once inside, the worms laid eggs in the liver, intestines, and bladder. Symptoms included blood in urine, chronic pain, anemia, organ damage, and eventual death. Autopsies on mummies show schistosomiasis was nearly universal among the poor. Worse still, food itself carried worms. Undercooked fish and pork transmitted tapeworms and trichinosis. Contaminated vegetables brought in roundworms. These infestations left people bloated, weak, and often permanently damaged. Children's growth was stunted. Adults suffered wasting, diarrhea, and chronic hunger, even while eating. Add to that dysentery, typhoid, and cholera, all spread through dirty food and water. And if that weren't enough, the cooking environment itself was hazardous. Most families cooked in cramped, smoky rooms with no ventilation. Fires burned dung, reeds, or straw. Inhaling that daily caused chronic lung disease, especially in women and children. Their ribs show signs of inflammation. Their skulls show sinus damage. And their lives? Short. We know this not from ancient texts, but from the bodies they left behind. Let's walk into an ancient Egyptian necropolis for a moment. In cemeteries across the Nile Valley, archaeologists have found thousands of skeletons. These aren't royal mummies or priestly burials. These are ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, brickmakers, basket weavers. The ones who lived at the edge of hunger. And their bones tell a story no scroll ever recorded. Most were under 5'5". Many had bowed legs from vitamin D deficiency. Nearly all had dental damage from coarse bread. Fractures were common, healed poorly or not at all. Signs of arthritis appeared by age 30. And everywhere parasites, parasites, parasites. One cemetery, found at Amarna, revealed skeletons with calcified liver flukes inside the rib cages. Another near Luxor showed children's spines warped by prolonged malnutrition. A study of pelvic bones from a village outside Thebes revealed iron deficiency anemia in over 60% of adults. And these people didn't die in war. They didn't die from Pharaoh's wrath. They died from what they ate, or what they couldn't eat. Let's not forget the famines. Egypt had many, often brought on by low Nile floods. If the waters didn't rise, the soil dried out. Crops failed. Granaries emptied. And the state? It demanded taxes anyway. When famine hit, the people ate anything. Cats, dogs, grass, mud. There are records, grim ones, of people boiling leather sandals to make soup, of children being sold for flour, of theft, riots, and mass migration. In the 22nd dynasty, a royal scribe recorded, the people ate their own excrement. They died, one upon another. It was not metaphor. Some tried to escape. They moved south to Nubia, west to the desert, or east to Canaan, but they brought their hunger with them. Entire villages vanished. Temple records show sudden drops in offerings because the people who made them were dead. Then, there were the religious food rules and how they backfired. Egypt had dozens of gods, and each had its own food taboos. Some prohibited pork, others forbade fish. Still others restricted onions or garlic. These rules weren't just ritual, they shaped entire regional diets. In some towns, you could be punished for eating the wrong food. One text from the New Kingdom describes a man beaten for roasting pork during a festival of Osiris. Another mentions a woman exiled for bringing salted fish into a temple precinct. But these restrictions didn't make food cleaner. They made it scarcer. If your region worshipped Sobek the crocodile god, you couldn't eat fish or crocodile. If your neighbors worshipped Set, the god of storms, they avoided pigs. That meant less variety, more monotony, and higher prices. It meant substituting one parasite-ridden meal for another. And speaking of substitutions, there was fake food, too. In poor households, meat was a dream. So people faked it. They took lentils, onions, and beans and mashed them into patties. Sometimes they added pig fat. Sometimes nothing. They roasted them to look like goose or lamb. These weren't delicacies, they were survival tactics. But lentils and beans in large quantities without proper soaking? They're toxic. They cause bloating, gas, and in some cases, actual poisoning. Combine that with bad water, and you've got a meal that hurts more than it helps. Even bread, the so-called staff of life, had its dangers. We talked about grit, but not about ash. In lean years, bakers added burned straw, chaff, or dung ash to stretch the flour. It gave the bread a dark color, almost like whole wheat. But it was full of toxins. People ate it anyway. They had no choice. And then there was the psychological toll. Imagine waking every day and knowing you'll eat the same thing. Beer mush and dry bread. No fruit, no meat, no flavor. Your teeth ache. Your stomach cramps. You're weak, but you have to haul bricks, dig canals, or clean fish all day. That kind of hunger isn't just physical, it's existential. It wears down your mind. It makes people desperate, cruel, paranoid. It breaks families. It kills hope. And yet, in tombs and temples, food is everywhere, painted, sculpted, idealized. The walls lie. They show abundance, joy, feasting. But the real story is written in the bones, the parasites, and the tears of the living. We often imagine ancient Egypt as a land of bounty, a place where the Nile flowed like a ribbon of life, and the people dined on figs, honey, roast goose, and fresh fish. That image has power. It's beautiful, and it's mostly false. So where did this fantasy come from? Look no further than the tombs. When the ancient Egyptians prepared for death, they didn't pack lightly. The walls of their tombs were covered with images of food, pyramids of bread, baskets of fruit, platters of roast ox, jars overflowing with wine, honey, and oil. But these weren't grocery lists. They were prayers. In Egyptian belief, what was painted could become real in the afterlife. So even the poorest tombs feature at least one carved offering table, drawn with magical precision. A single loaf of bread, drawn correctly, could feed a soul forever, at least in theory. But why was food such a central obsession? Because in life, it was so hard to come by. The afterlife, to the ancient Egyptian, was a place where no one starved, where no one went thirsty, where bread was soft, wine sweet, and the liver never hurt. It was paradise precisely because Earth had been such a grinding, grueling banquet of disappointment. And here's where things get really interesting. Egyptian religion didn't just promise food, it made food sacred. Priests offered it to the gods. Farmers grew it for the state. Families placed it on household altars. Even magic spells were designed to produce food out of thin air. In one text, a man recites, "Come to me, loaf. Come to me, beer," as if conjuring dinner from a void. It reveals something powerful. Hunger was not just biological. It was spiritual. But while priests prayed, the poor scavenged. And sometimes, they stole. Records from the Middle and New Kingdoms include hundreds of complaints about stolen food, loaves taken from granaries, beer siphoned from temples, sacrificial geese disappearing mysteriously before dawn. These weren't just petty crimes, they were acts of desperation. And they carried divine penalties. In the Book of the Dead, one of the key sins the soul must deny is, "I have not stolen bread." Bread was more than food. It was morality, identity, life itself, which makes one particular story all the more chilling. In a papyrus from the 20th dynasty, a group of grave robbers is interrogated. Under torture, one of them confesses to breaking into a noblewoman's tomb. not to steal gold, but to take the bread and dried meat left for her journey into the afterlife. He didn't believe in her soul. He believed in his stomach. Even in death, the elite were fed better than the living. But the illusion couldn't hold forever. As centuries passed, Egypt weakened. The Nile's floods became erratic. The central government fractured. Foreign invaders came and went: Hyksos, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. And with each wave, food became a weapon. Grain was taxed mercilessly. Famine became more frequent. The temples hoarded stores while villagers starved. Soldiers raided fields. Corrupt officials demanded bribes of butter and oil. What little people had, they clung to. And so Egyptian cuisine began to shrink, not in size, but in diversity. By the time of the late period, many of the ancient recipes had vanished. Traditional spices disappeared. Exotic fruits became mythical. Only the core remained: bread, beer, onions, lentils. The same four notes, over and over again, like a dirge played on a broken flute. And yet, through it all, the people endured. They adapted. They developed ingenious survival strategies: pickling, fermenting, drying. They grew gardens along rooftops. They turned desert weeds into stew. They shared what little they had during festivals. Community, not cuisine, became the real nourishment. But let's zoom out. Because if ancient Egypt's food was so bad, why does it still fascinate us? Why do tourists today buy pharaoh's feasts at themed restaurants, or watch cooking channels try to recreate authentic Egyptian bread, or marvel at the menus painted inside tombs? The answer is simple: we've mistaken art for reality. Tomb paintings weren't documentaries. They were idealized fantasies. Propaganda for the afterlife. No poor Egyptian ate 5 kinds of fowl with figs and lotus wine. No peasant sipped palm date syrup with roast antelope. These were dreams, hope dressed in color. The real food of Egypt? It was coarse, repetitive, disease-ridden, and backbreaking to produce. So what's the lesson? That even in a civilization as mighty, as enduring, and as spiritually rich as Egypt, the basics of survival, food, clean water, sanitation, were a daily struggle. Not just for the poor. For everyone who wasn't protected by a temple wall or buried inside a gilded sarcophagus. And that hunger shaped the very soul of a nation. It molded their gods, gods of grain, fermentation, fields, irrigation. It molded their rituals, offering tables, funerary feasts, purification rites. It molded their magic, spells to summon food, spells to preserve it, spells to stop others from stealing it in the afterlife. Even their architecture, pyramids, mastabas, obelisks, points to an obsession with permanence in a world where nothing lasted, especially food. So maybe that's why Egypt lasted so long. Because the people knew hunger better than most. They planned for it, feared it, mythologized it. And in doing so, they outlived empire after empire. They turned their suffering into story, into ritual, into legacy. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we're still talking about them. Not because they dined like gods, but because they starved like us.